Hello friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The CB radio had been dead quiet for the past 40 minutes, which wasn't unusual for this stretch of New Mexico highway, but it still made Hollis Creed uneasy in a way he couldn't quite articulate. He'd been hauling freight for 16 years, mostly agricultural equipment and construction materials across the Southwest, and silence on the radio usually meant either everyone was asleep or nobody wanted to be on this particular road after dark. The digital clock on his Kenworth's dashboard showed 9:47 p.m. in pale green numbers, and the temperature gauge read 72 degrees, though the desert night felt colder than that through the slightly cracked window he kept open to stay alert. The load he was carrying, 30,000 pounds of industrial piping destined for a mining operation outside Albuquerque, had seemed straightforward enough when he'd picked it up in Tucson that morning. The dispatcher had given him the standard route, Interstate 10 to Interstate 25, straight shot north with maybe one fuel stop if he managed his time right. But road construction near Deming had forced him onto this detour, State Route 152, cutting through the absolute middle of nowhere, through mountains that looked like God had crumpled up the earth and forgotten to smooth it back out. His GPS had protested the detour at first, showing the road as a thin gray line with warnings about steep grades and sharp curves, but the highway patrol officer directing traffic had assured him it was passable for commercial vehicles and would save him 2 hours compared to sitting in the construction backup. Hollis had trusted that assessment, mostly because he didn't have much choice, and for the first hour, the road had been exactly what the officer promised. Winding and steep in places, sure, but well-maintained and wide enough for his rig to handle without too much stress. The problem started when his fuel gauge began dropping faster than it should have been, the needle sliding from half full to a quarter tank in what felt like 15 minutes. He'd tapped the gauge twice with his knuckle, an old habit that never actually fixed anything but made him feel better about mechanical problems, and watched the needle bounce slightly before settling even lower than before. The nearest fuel stop, according to his GPS, was still 63 miles ahead, a truck plaza on the outskirts of Truth or Consequences, and at his current rate of consumption, he wasn't sure he'd make it that far. His emergency fuel reserves would get him maybe another 40 miles if he pushed it, but that still left him 23 miles short, assuming the gauge was even accurate anymore. The road curved sharply to the left, and his headlights swept across a weathered brown sign so faded he almost missed it. The letters were barely visible, worn down by decades of sun and sandstorms, but he could just make out the words, Dead Miners Crossing, 8 miles, followed by an arrow pointing down a narrow dirt road that branched off to the right. Below that, in smaller letters that he had to squint to read, Services available. No population number, no other information, just that cryptic promise of services that could mean anything from a gas station to a vending machine outside an abandoned post office. Still, 8 miles was better than 63, and if this Dead Miners Crossing place had even a small fuel pump, he could top off enough to reach the truck plaza without having to call for a tow in the middle of the night. Hollis clicked on his turn signal out of habit, even though there wasn't another vehicle in sight, and began the careful process of slowing his loaded rig for the turn onto the dirt road. The transition from asphalt to packed earth sent a different vibration through the cab, a rougher, more unpredictable rhythm that made his coffee thermos rattle in its holder. The road was barely wide enough for his truck, with desert scrub pressing in close on both sides, branches occasionally scraping against his mirrors with sounds like fingernails on metal. His headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness ahead, illuminating dust particles that hung in the air like suspended snow, and he could see jackrabbits frozen in the glare before they bolted into the safety of the brush. The 8 miles felt more like 80, each minute stretching out as the road wound through terrain that got progressively more desolate. No lights appeared in the distance, no reassuring glow of civilization, just more darkness and more desert. He checked his phone twice and found exactly what he expected. No signal at all, the screen showing those infuriating words, "No service," as if that was somehow helpful information. His CB radio continued its silent treatment. Not even static, just the faint electronic hum that told him the equipment was working, but nobody was out there to talk to. The fuel gauge had dropped another notch by the time he crested a small rise and finally saw something that wasn't desert or darkness. Dead Miners Crossing appeared in his headlights like a mirage made solid. A collection of maybe 24 buildings scattered along both sides of a single dirt street that looked like it had been transplanted from 1952 and left to rot. Most of the structures were single-story, built from desert stone and weathered wood that had been bleached gray by the sun. Several buildings had collapsed roofs, walls caving inward like broken ribs, windows either missing entirely or covered with boards so warped they barely served their purpose. A few buildings still seemed intact, or at least upright, including what looked like a small diner on the left side of the street, its windows showing dim interior lights that created rectangles of pale yellow against the surrounding darkness. Next to the diner stood a building with a hand-painted sign that read General Supply, and beyond that was a structure that might have been a boarding house, 2 stories tall with a sagging balcony that looked like it could collapse at any moment. What caught his attention most, though, was the fuel pump standing in front of what appeared to be an old service station on the right side of the street. The pump was ancient, probably hadn't been manufactured since the Eisenhower administration, one of those tall red cylinders with a glass top and analog numbers that flipped over mechanically when fuel was dispensed. It stood there like a forgotten monument, and while Hollis had serious doubts about whether it still functioned, it was the only option he had at the moment. He guided his rig down the main street, driving slowly to avoid potholes that could have swallowed his front tires, and pulled up alongside the pump, positioning his fuel tanks as close as the awkward angle would allow. The silence after he killed his engine was absolute and immediately unsettling. No wind, no insects, no distant hum of highway traffic, just a dead quiet that felt almost solid, like sound itself had given up on this place. Hollis sat in his cab for a moment, hands still resting on the steering wheel, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness beyond his headlights. He'd been in plenty of small desert towns over the years, places that time had mostly forgotten, but something about Dead Miners Crossing felt different, wrong in a way that made the hair on his forearms stand up. The buildings were too still, the shadows too deep, and that dim light from the diner windows flickered occasionally in a pattern that didn't match any electrical system he'd ever seen. He grabbed his flashlight from the door pocket, a heavy mag light that doubled as a decent weapon if things got weird, and climbed down from the cab. His boots hit the dirt street with soft thuds, and he stood there for a moment letting his legs adjust to being upright after 8 hours behind the wheel. The air smelled like dust, and something else. Something metallic and old like pennies that had been sitting in a jar for decades. He approached the fuel pump with his flashlight beam leading the way, and up close, the equipment looked even more ancient than he'd thought. The hose was cracked rubber patched in places with electrical tape that had turned brittle and yellow. The nozzle was a heavy metal thing that probably weighed 5 pounds, and the price display showed 19 cents per gallon. A number so outdated it was almost funny, except nothing about this situation felt humorous. Hollis tried the handle anyway, giving it an experimental squeeze, and was genuinely shocked when he heard the mechanical click of the internal mechanisms engaging. The pump was live, somehow, impossibly. He could hear fuel moving through ancient pipes, a gurgling sound that suggested the underground tank still held something flammable. He positioned the nozzle in his truck's fuel port and squeezed the handle again, watching with a mixture of relief and disbelief as actual diesel began flowing into his tank. The pump's analog display started clicking through numbers, the metal flippers turning over one by one, showing gallons consumed in that satisfying mechanical way that digital displays had never quite matched. He'd take it, outdated and weird as it was, because it beat calling for a tow and explaining to his dispatcher why he'd run out of fuel in the middle of the New Mexico desert. While his tank filled, Hollis turned his attention to the diner, that pale yellow light still flickering in its windows. The building was small, maybe 12 feet wide and twice that deep, with a flat roof and walls made from stacked desert stone that had been mortared together by someone who clearly knew their craft. A faded sign above the door read, "Myrna's Place," in letters that might have been red once but had faded to a dull pink. Through the window, he could see a counter with a half-dozen stools, most of them occupied by shadows that might have been people, or might have been tricks of the light. One shadow moved, definitely a person, shifting on their stool in a way that suggested life, and Hollis felt his pulse quicken slightly. People meant answers, information, maybe an explanation for why this town existed at all and why his GPS had never bothered to mention it despite the services it supposedly offered. The pump clicked off after dispensing 42 gallons. His tank's now full enough to get him to Albuquerque twice over if needed. He secured the nozzle back on the pump and looked around for some kind of payment system, a card reader or a door to knock on to find whoever maintained this place. He found neither. Just the pump standing alone in the darkness like a sentinel that didn't care about money or credit cards or modern conveniences. After standing there for a full minute waiting for someone to emerge and demand payment, he decided to try the diner, both to settle his bill and to satisfy his growing curiosity about what kind of people lived in a place called Dead Miners Crossing. The diner's door opened with a rusty squeal that cut through the silence like a knife, and Hollis stepped inside to find himself in a space that felt like it had been preserved in amber since the 1950s. The counter was real chrome and red vinyl, worn smooth by decades of use, and the stools were the swivel kind with seats that had been patched with duct tape in several places. The walls were covered in dark wood paneling that had warped in places from heat and age, and the floor was black and white checkerboard linoleum with several tiles missing, revealing bare concrete underneath. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their tubes yellowed with age and flickering in that irregular pattern he'd noticed from outside, casting everything in a sickly pale glow that made everyone's skin look slightly jaundiced. 3 people sat at the counter, all of them turning to look at him when he entered, their movements synchronized in a way that felt rehearsed. The nearest was an old man, probably in his 70s, with skin like tanned leather and eyes so pale blue they were almost white. He wore denim overalls over a faded thermal shirt, and his hands wrapped around a coffee mug were knotted with arthritis, the fingers bent at odd angles. Beyond him sat a younger man, maybe in his 40s, with black hair slicked back with something that made it shine like oil in the fluorescent light. He was drinking from a glass of water, or at least clear liquid, and his eyes tracked Hollis with an intensity that made the driver uncomfortable. The third person was a woman in her 60s, rail thin with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, wearing a waitress uniform that consisted of a pink dress with white trim and a small white apron that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. The woman behind the counter, who Hollis assumed was Myrna based on the sign outside, looked to be in her late 50s with bottle blonde hair teased into a style that had been popular during the Carter administration. She had sharp features, a pointed chin, and prominent cheekbones, and her lipstick was a bright red that had bled slightly into the fine lines around her mouth. She wore a similar waitress uniform to the other woman, but hers was cleaner, pressed even, and she had a name tag pinned to her chest that confirmed his guess: Myrna Jo Tate, in white letters on black plastic. "Evening, stranger," she said, her voice carrying a thick southwestern accent that turned the simple greeting into something that took 3 seconds to deliver. "Don't get many truckers through here anymore. Roads mostly forgotten, if you take my meaning. You lost, or just unlucky?" Her smile revealed teeth that were too white to be natural. Dentures, probably. And her eyes held a kind of knowing amusement that suggested she'd asked this question before and already knew how he'd answer. Hollis removed his baseball cap, an old habit his father had taught him, and approached the counter, choosing a stool 2 spaces away from the old man in overalls. "Neither, really. Construction detour put me on this road, and my fuel situation put me in your town. That pump out there actually works, which is about the most surprising thing I've seen all week. I filled up about 40 gallons, need to know what I owe and who to pay." He pulled his wallet from his back pocket, flipping it open to show he had both cash and cards, prepared for whatever archaic payment system this place might use. Myrna Joe Tate waved his wallet away with a dismissive flick of her wrist, her red nails catching the fluorescent light. "Pump doesn't take money anymore. Town council decided years back that anyone desperate enough to make it all the way out here deserves free fuel. Consider it a courtesy from dead miners crossing to the wider world. We're friendly folks, mostly." That last word, mostly, hung in the air with an implied weight that made Hollis's stomach tighten slightly. The old man in overalls spoke up, his voice rough like gravel being dragged over concrete. "Don't mind Myrna. She likes to play up the spooky angle for visitors. Town's perfectly safe, just old is all. I'm Abner Holt, been living here since before you were born, I'd wager. This fellow next to me is just passing through like yourself, didn't catch his name." He gestured to the younger man with the slicked-back hair, who nodded but didn't offer any introduction. Myrna Joe Tate poured Hollis a cup of coffee without asking if he wanted one. The liquid black as tar and probably twice as thick. "You planning to drive on through tonight? Or you need a place to rest? Boarding house across the street has rooms, real cheap since nobody much uses them. $5 gets you a bed and running water, though the water runs brown for the first minute, so let it clear before you try bathing." She slid the coffee across the counter, and Hollis caught it before it could slide off the edge, the mug warm against his palms. He took a sip, more out of politeness than actual desire, and found the coffee bitter but strong, effective in the way that truck stop coffee usually was. "Appreciate the offer, but I need to make Albuquerque by morning. Just wanted to settle up for the fuel and maybe ask some questions about this place, if you don't mind. My GPS doesn't even show this town, and I've been driving through New Mexico for years without knowing it existed." He kept his tone casual, conversational, but his eyes were scanning the diner, noting details. The kitchen area was dark, no cooking smells or sounds of preparation, and the fluorescent lights flickered in a pattern that seemed almost rhythmic now that he was paying attention. Abner Holt made a sound that might have been a laugh but came out more like a cough. "Town's not on most maps anymore, hasn't been since the mine closed back in '68. Used to be a copper operation. Employed about 300 men at its peak, but the vein ran dry and the company pulled out overnight, left behind all these buildings and about a dozen families too stubborn to leave. We're what's left, the holdouts. Town's dying slow, but we're not dead yet, despite what the name might suggest." His pale blue eyes fixed on Hollis with an intensity that belied his casual tone. The man with slicked-back hair finally spoke, his voice surprisingly high-pitched, almost feminine. "You should stay the night. Road out of here gets tricky in the dark, lots of curves and no guardrails. Plenty of crosses along the roadside where people misjudge the turns. $5 is cheap insurance against joining them." He smiled when he said it, but the expression didn't reach his eyes, which remained flat and cold. Something about the way everyone was encouraging him to stay made Hollis want to do the opposite. his instincts screaming at him to finish his coffee, say his thanks, and get back on the road as quickly as possible. But he also knew his body's limitations, knew that 8 hours of driving, followed by another 4 or 5 to reach Albuquerque, was pushing into dangerous territory where exhaustion could be as deadly as any sharp curve. The logical part of his brain was already calculating the risk-reward ratio, weighing the strangeness of this town against the very real danger of falling asleep at the wheel somewhere in the mountains. The logical part was starting to win, much as he hated to admit it. "Maybe I will stay," he heard himself saying, the words coming out before he'd fully committed to the decision. "Just a few hours to sleep, then I'll be gone before dawn. That boarding house you mentioned, Myrna, is there someone I need to see about a room, or do I just pick one?" He pulled a $5 bill from his wallet, old and worn, but still legal tender, and placed it on the counter between them. Myrna Joe Tate's smile widened, and for just a moment Hollis thought he saw something else in her expression. Something that might have been relief or satisfaction, or maybe hunger, though that didn't make any sense. She picked up the $5 bill with those red-nailed fingers and tucked it into her apron pocket. "Boarding house doesn't lock. Just walk in and take the first room on the right. Bed's already made, sheets are clean enough. Keys hanging on a nail by the door frame, though you won't need it since nobody in this town steals from guests. We have our peculiarities, but we're not thieves." She refilled his coffee without asking, the liquid steaming slightly as it hit the mug. Abner Holt stood up from his stool with the careful movements of someone whose joints didn't work as well as they used to. "I'll walk you over, show you where things are. Town's dark at night. Easy to get turned around if you don't know the layout." He dropped a few coins on the counter, pennies and nickels that looked like they'd been minted decades ago, and shuffled toward the door without waiting for Hollis's response. The trucker drained his coffee in 3 long gulps, the bitterness coating his tongue, and stood to follow. The man with slicked back hair watched him leave with those cold eyes, and Myrna Joe Tate was already refilling the other customers' cups before the door squealed shut behind him. Outside, the darkness felt thicker than before, more oppressive, and Hollis's truck sat where he'd left it, illuminated by a single functioning streetlight that cast long shadows across the hood. Abner Holt moved with surprising speed for his age, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust as he crossed the street toward the boarding house. "You'll want to keep your door closed tonight," he said over his shoulder, his voice barely above a whisper. "Town gets strange after midnight. Noises you can't explain, shadows that move wrong. Nothing that'll hurt you probably, but nothing that'll help you sleep either if you let it get in your head. Best to just ignore whatever you hear and keep your eyes shut until morning." "What kind of noises?" Hollis asked, his hand instinctively moving to the maglite on his belt. "Animals? Wind? What are we talking about here?" But Abner Holt had already reached the boarding house steps and was climbing them without answering, leaving Hollis to follow and wonder what exactly he'd agreed to by deciding to stay in Dead Miners Crossing. The boarding house stairs creaked under Hollis's weight in a way that suggested the wood had been slowly rotting for decades, each step producing a slightly different pitch of complaint. Abner Holt reached the top first and pushed open the front door, which swung inward with a prolonged groan that echoed through what sounded like a completely empty interior. No light came from inside, just a rectangle of deeper darkness that smelled like dust and something else, something organic and unpleasant that Hollis couldn't quite identify. He clicked on his maglite before crossing the threshold, the beam cutting through the gloom to reveal a narrow hallway with walls covered in peeling floral wallpaper that might have been pink once but had faded to a sickly beige. The first door on the right stood slightly ajar, and Abner Holt pushed it open fully, revealing a small room maybe 10 feet by 12 with a single bed pushed against the far wall. The bed frame was iron, painted white but chipped in places to show rust underneath, and the mattress looked thin enough that Hollis figured he'd be feeling the springs by morning. A wooden chair sat in the corner, one leg slightly shorter than the others, and a small dresser with a cracked mirror occupied the space beside the door. The room's single window was covered with a sheet that had been tacked to the frame, the fabric yellowed and torn in places. A bare light bulb hung from the ceiling on a frayed cord, but when Hollis tried the switch on the wall, nothing happened. "Power's intermittent," Abner Holt explained, moving to the dresser and pulling open the top drawer to reveal a camping lantern and a box of matches. "House wiring's older than I am, and nobody's bothered to update it in 40 years. Lantern works fine, though. Got fresh batteries last month." He lifted the lantern and clicked it on, bathing the room in a pale LED glow that somehow made everything look worse, more decayed, like the light was revealing details better left hidden. Hollis could see water stains on the ceiling now, spreading out from the corners like brown flowers, and the floorboards were warped in places, creating uneven surfaces that would make walking in the dark treacherous. The old man set the lantern on the dresser and moved toward the door, his pale eyes reflecting the light in a way that made them look almost luminescent. "Key's right here on this nail, like Myrna said, but you won't need it. Door latches from the inside with this deadbolt, see?" He demonstrated, sliding a heavy brass bolt into place with a solid click. "Bathroom's down the hall, second door on the left. Water runs brown at first, but clears up if you're patient. There's a pump out back if the taps don't work. Happens sometimes when the pressure drops. Any questions before I leave you to it?" Hollis had about 100 questions, starting with why anyone would choose to live in a place this deteriorated, and ending with what exactly Abner meant by the town getting strange after midnight. But he was tired enough that the questions felt heavy in his mind, weighted down by the exhaustion settling into his bones. "I'm good," he said, setting his overnight bag on the chair. "Appreciate the help. I'll be out of here before sunrise, back on the road where I belong." Abner Holt nodded slowly, his expression unreadable in the lantern light. "Most folks say that, some of them even manage it." He pulled the door shut as he left, his footsteps fading down the hallway and then the stairs, each creak growing fainter until Hollis heard the front door close with a distant thud. The silence that followed was absolute, pressing in on him from all sides like something physical. He could hear his own breathing, the slight whistle in his nose from a deviated septum he'd never bothered to get fixed, and the faint ticking of his watch marking seconds that felt longer than they should. He slid the deadbolt home and tested it twice, pulling on the door to make sure it held firm. The mechanism was solid despite its age, and that gave him some small measure of comfort. He'd slept in worse places over the years, truck stops with questionable security and rest areas where the bathroom lights flickered with the same sickly frequency he'd seen in Myrna's diner. This was just another night in another forgotten place, nothing more. He repeated that thought like a mantra as he kicked off his boots and stretched out on the bed fully clothed, not trusting the sheets enough to get under them. The mattress was every bit as uncomfortable as he'd predicted, springs poking through the thin padding to press against his back and shoulders, but exhaustion was already pulling him down toward sleep. The last thing he remembered before drifting off was the sound of his own breathing and the distant rumble of what might have been thunder, though the sky had been clear when he'd walked from the diner to the boarding house. Sleep came in stages, consciousness fading like someone slowly turning down a dimmer switch, and for a while everything was dark and peaceful, and exactly what he needed after 8 hours behind the wheel. The scraping sound woke him. His eyes snapped open to find the room darker than before, the camping lantern having dimmed to almost nothing, just a faint orange glow that barely penetrated the shadows gathering in the corners. He lay perfectly still, listening, trying to identify the source of the sound that had pulled him from sleep. It came again, a long, drawn-out scrape like metal dragging across wood, coming from somewhere below him. The floor, he realized, The sound was coming through the floorboards from whatever space existed beneath the boarding house. Hollis sat up slowly, the bed spring squeaking in protest, and checked his watch. The digital display showed 12:47 a.m. in glowing green numbers, which meant he'd been asleep for maybe an hour and a half. The scraping continued, rhythmic now, dragging and pausing, moving in what seemed like a deliberate pattern across the space below. He could hear other sounds now that he was fully awake. Faint voices speaking in tones too low to make out words, and something that might have been hammering, metal striking metal in irregular intervals. "Keep your door closed tonight. Town gets strange after midnight." Abner Holt's words echoed in his memory, and Hollis found himself wondering what exactly the old man had meant by strange. This didn't feel like random noise or the settling of an old building. This felt purposeful, organized, like people were working on something in the middle of the night directly beneath where he was trying to sleep. He swung his legs off the bed and stood, his sock feet finding the warped floorboards, and moved to the window. The sheet tacked over it was thin enough that he could see light bleeding through from outside. Not the steady glow of streetlights, but something flickering and orange, like firelight. He pulled back the corner of the sheet and looked out onto the main street of Dead Miners Crossing. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat, and his pulse quicken to a rate that felt unsustainable. The street was full of people, dozens of them, maybe more, moving in and out of buildings with an urgency that hadn't been present when he'd arrived. They carried lanterns and flashlights, creating pools of moving light that swept across building facades and illuminated faces for brief moments before plunging them back into shadow. Several men were loading something into a truck parked near the old service station, heavy objects wrapped in canvas that took 2 people to lift. Others were entering and exiting the general supply building, emerging with boxes and crates that they stacked in neat piles on the street. The scraping sound came again, louder now, and Hollis looked down to see a man directly below his window dragging what appeared to be a section of metal railing across the dirt. The man stopped, repositioned his grip, and continued dragging toward a growing pile of scrap metal that sat in front of the building adjacent to the boarding house. His face was covered in dust or ash, making it impossible to determine his age, and he wore clothing that looked decades out of date, work pants held up with suspenders, and a shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. He didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the window above him, just kept working with the single-minded focus of someone on a schedule. Hollis let the sheet fall back into place and backed away from the window, his mind racing to make sense of what he'd seen. This wasn't random activity. This was organized, coordinated, like the entire town had been waiting for him to fall asleep before beginning whatever work they'd been planning. The voices below the floorboards continued their low murmur, joined now by the sound of footsteps moving through the boarding house itself. He could hear someone on the stairs, ascending slowly, each step careful and measured. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and moved down the hallway, growing closer to his room. He grabbed his mag light and moved to stand beside the door, out of the direct line of sight if someone looked through the keyhole. The footsteps stopped right outside his room, and he could see the doorknob begin to turn slowly, testing the lock. The deadbolt held firm, and after a moment the doorknob stopped moving. Whoever was out there didn't knock, didn't call out, just stood there on the other side of the door. Hollis could hear breathing now, slow and steady, and the faint creak of floorboards as weight shifted from one foot to the other. "Room's occupied," Hollis called out, trying to keep his voice steady and authoritative. "Paid for the night, so move along." The breathing stopped immediately, and for several seconds there was absolute silence. Then came a voice, male and unfamiliar, speaking in a tone that was almost conversational. "Just checking to make sure you're comfortable. Building's old, walls are thin, figured you might be disturbed by the noise. We can work quieter if it's bothering you." The voice was pleasant enough, but something about it felt wrong, too friendly, like someone trying very hard to sound normal and overshooting into uncanny territory. Hollis moved closer to the door but didn't open it. "What are you all doing out there? It's nearly 1 in the morning. Seems like an odd time for whatever work you're doing." He kept his hand wrapped around the maglite, ready to use it as a weapon if needed. Through the thin walls he could hear movement in other rooms now, footsteps and dragging sounds, and he realized he might not be the only guest in the boarding house despite what Myrna had implied. The voice on the other side of the door paused before answering. "Reclamation project. Town council decided to salvage what we can before the last of the buildings collapse. Metal, copper wiring, anything that still has value. We work at night because the heat during the day makes it impossible. Desert gets up to 110 sometimes. No reason to concern yourself. We'll be done before morning and you can drive out of here without ever thinking about dead miners crossing again." Most people do exactly that. Something about the phrasing bothered Hollis. The way the man said most people instead of everyone. "And what about the people who don't forget?" he asked, his voice dropping lower. "What happens to them?" The silence that followed was longer this time, stretching out for 10 or 15 seconds. When the voice came back, it had lost some of its forced friendliness, replaced with something flatter, more businesslike. "They tend to stay longer than they planned. Helps us with the reclamation work, actually. Always need extra hands, especially for the heavy lifting. But that won't be you. You've got places to be, schedule to keep. We respect that. Just wanted to check on you, make sure you're settled. Sleep well." The footsteps retreated down the hallway and descended the stairs, fading into the general noise of whatever work was happening throughout the town. Hollis stood by the door for a full minute, listening to the sounds filtering up through the floorboards and seeping through the walls. The scraping continued, joined by hammering and the occasional shout of someone coordinating movement of heavy objects. He moved back to the window and looked out again, this time counting the people he could see. 17 on the street itself, with more entering and exiting buildings every few seconds. The truck he'd seen earlier was gone, replaced by a flatbed loaded with what looked like sections of wooden framing and bundles of copper pipe. 2 men were securing the load with rope, working in synchronized movements that suggested they'd done this many times before. His truck sat where he'd left it, untouched and almost glowing under the single working streetlight. The distance between the boarding house and his Kenworth was maybe 60 feet, a straight shot across the main street if he moved fast. The smart play would be to grab his bag, walk out the front door like he owned the place, climb into his cab, and drive until Dead Miners Crossing was nothing but a memory in his rearview mirror. The dumb play would be to stay here until morning and see what these people were really doing, satisfying his curiosity at the potential cost of getting pulled into whatever reclamation work they were so focused on. He was still weighing his options when he heard the sound of a truck engine starting somewhere nearby, followed by another and then a third. Through the window, he watched 3 pickup trucks pull into the street from various side roads, their beds already loaded with salvaged materials. They formed a loose convoy and drove slowly through the town, heading toward the road that led back to the highway. Within minutes they were gone, taillights disappearing into the desert darkness, and the activity on the street began to wind down. People started returning to buildings, extinguishing lanterns, reducing the overall light level until only a few scattered sources remained. Hollis made his decision. He grabbed his overnight bag, pulled on his boots without bothering to lace them properly, and moved to the door. The deadbolt slid back with a click that sounded impossibly loud in the relative quiet, and he pulled the door open slowly, checking the hallway before stepping out. Empty, at least visibly, though he could still hear movement somewhere else in the building. He moved quickly toward the stairs, his boots making soft thuds on the warped floorboards, and descended as quietly as his size and urgency would allow. The front door of the boarding house stood slightly ajar, and he pushed through into the night air, which felt cooler than it had any right to be. The street was nearly empty now, just a few stragglers finishing whatever tasks they'd been assigned. He recognized Myrna Jo Tate standing in the doorway of her diner, watching the remaining workers with her arms crossed over her chest. She saw him immediately, her head turning to track his movement as he crossed toward his truck, but she didn't call out or try to stop him. Abner Holt emerged from the general supply building carrying a box that looked heavy despite his age, and when he spotted Hollis, he set the box down and walked over to intercept him. "Couldn't sleep through the noise," he said, not phrasing it as a question. "Told you the town gets strange after midnight. We're not trying to disturb anyone. It's just the work needs doing, and nighttime's the only time we can do it without attracting attention from passing aircraft or satellites. Government's particular about abandoned towns, likes to make sure they stay abandoned." Hollis stopped a few feet from his truck, his hand already reaching for his keys. "What exactly are you salvaging that requires this much secrecy? Because this doesn't feel like a simple reclamation project. This feels like you're hiding something, and I've spent enough years on the road to recognize when a situation is about to go bad." He kept his voice level but firm, making it clear he wasn't looking for trouble, but wasn't about to be intimidated either. Abner Holt's pale eyes studied him for a moment, and then the old man smiled, revealing teeth that looked too perfect for someone his age. "Smart man, you're right to be cautious. What we're doing here isn't exactly legal, but it's not harmful either. The mine that closed in '68 didn't run dry like I told you earlier. It hit something, a vein of ore so rich the company that owned it decided to seal the tunnels and abandon the operation rather than report it. Corporate politics, something about mineral rights they didn't want to share with the government. They paid off the workers, built these buildings as a consolation prize, and told everyone the copper was gone." The old man moved closer, lowering his voice even though no one else was within earshot. "Problem is, a few of us knew the truth. We stayed behind after the company pulled out, reopened the tunnels, and we've been quietly mining that vein for the past 50 years. We sell the ore through back channels, use the money to maintain the equipment and pay for supplies. The salvage work you're seeing tonight is actually removing safety equipment and shoring materials from abandoned sections of the mine. We relocate it to active areas where it's needed. Can't exactly order that stuff through normal suppliers without raising questions about why we need it." Hollis processed this information, trying to determine if it made sense or if Abner was feeding him a story designed to sound plausible while hiding something worse. "And the people who stay longer than they planned? What's that about?" He moved closer to his truck, reducing the distance between himself and escape. Abner Holt shrugged, a gesture that looked almost rehearsed. "Sometimes we offer them work. Pays good, cash only, no taxes. Some folks need that kind of arrangement, especially if they're running from something or trying to start over somewhere no one will find them. But you're not that kind of person. You've got a clean record, a life waiting for you in Albuquerque. You'll drive out of here, deliver your load, and by tomorrow night you'll be having dinner somewhere nice, telling your friends about the weird ghost town you stumbled into that one time. That's how this usually goes. Usually, but not always." The implication hung between them, and Hollis decided he'd heard enough. He pulled his keys from his pocket and moved to his truck door, unlocking it with the remote and pulling it open in one smooth motion. "Appreciate the honesty, and the fuel. I'll be leaving now." He climbed into the cab and started the engine, the diesel rumbling to life with a sound that felt reassuring in its familiarity. Abner Holt stepped back, raising one hand in a farewell gesture that seemed almost mocking. "Safe travels. And if you're smart, you'll forget you ever saw this place. GPS doesn't show it for a reason." He turned and walked back toward the general supply building, disappearing through its dark doorway without looking back. Hollis put the truck in gear and began the careful process of maneuvering out of the tight spot where he'd parked. His headlights swept across the buildings as he turned, and he caught a glimpse of faces in windows, people watching him leave with expressions he couldn't quite read. Myrna, Joe Tate, was still standing in her diner doorway, and as he drove past, she raised one hand in a wave that felt more like a dismissal than a goodbye. The dirt road leading back to the highway felt longer in the darkness, every turn and dip more pronounced than they'd been on his way in. He checked his mirrors constantly, half expecting to see headlights following him, but the road behind stayed empty and black. His CB radio crackled to life suddenly, making him jump, and a voice came through the speaker, distorted by static but still recognizable as Abner Holt. "Hollis Creed, driver of Kenworth, registered to Allied Transport out of Phoenix. Just wanted you to know we've got your information now. Plate number, truck identification, even your social security number from the credit card you offered Myrna but didn't use. We like to keep records of everyone who passes through, just in case we need to reach out someday. You understand?" The transmission cut off before Hollis could respond, and when he tried to key his mic to answer, nothing happened. The radio was dead, not even static anymore, just silence. He drove faster, pushing the rig harder than he normally would on an unfamiliar dirt road, and when he finally reached the paved highway 20 minutes later, he nearly sobbed with relief. The road stretched out in both directions, empty and ordinary and exactly what he needed. He drove north toward Albuquerque, and by the time the sun started rising behind him, painting the desert in shades of orange and gold, Dead Miners Crossing felt like something that might have been a dream except for one detail. When he stopped to fuel up at a truck plaza outside Truth or Consequences, he discovered a small cloth bag tucked under his windshield wiper held in place with a rubber band. Inside was $5 in old coins dated from the 1960s, and a handwritten note on yellowed paper that read, "Payment for future services will be in touch." Hollis threw the bag in a trash can and drove away, but the note stayed with him, word for word, burned into his memory. 3 weeks later, he received a text message from an unknown number, just a set of GPS coordinates and the words, "Another delivery waiting," same terms as before. He deleted the message and changed his phone number, but somewhere in the back of his mind he knew it wouldn't matter. Dead Miners Crossing had his information, and people who operated that far off the books didn't let potential assets simply walk away. He still drives trucks, still hauls freight across the Southwest, but now he plans his routes carefully, avoiding State Route 152 and any road that might lead him back to that forgotten town in the middle of the New Mexico desert. Sometimes, late at night when he's pulled over at a rest stop, he sees trucks with no company markings idling nearby, and he wonders if they're from Dead Miners Crossing, watching, waiting, making sure he remembers the debt they believe he owes them. He's never gone back, and he never will, but the fear that someday he won't have a choice keeps him checking his mirrors more than he should. 6 months passed before Hollis Creed made the mistake of thinking he'd escaped Dead Miners Crossing for good. 6 months of deliberately rooting around that entire section of New Mexico, adding hours to his trips and burning extra fuel to avoid even the possibility of ending up on State Route 152 again. His dispatcher had questioned the routing changes at first, pointing out that he was costing the company money with his detours, but Hollis had blamed it on road conditions and uncomfortable rest stops, vague excuses that were accepted without much scrutiny. The extra miles meant less profit for him personally, cutting into his per-mile rate. But he considered it cheap insurance against whatever those people in that ghost town had planned for him. The text messages had continued sporadically throughout those 6 months, always from different numbers that showed up as unknown or blocked on his phone's display. Most were just coordinates, GPS locations scattered across Arizona, New Mexico, and West Texas, always accompanied by cryptic phrases like "pickup available," or "delivery pending," or his personal favorite, "your route passes nearby." He'd deleted each one immediately after reading it, a compulsive habit that gave him the illusion of control, even though he knew the messages would keep coming regardless of what he did. Twice he'd considered going to the police, actually driven to a highway patrol station with his phone full of screenshots, but each time he'd sat in the parking lot trying to figure out what exactly he'd report. Some people from a town that doesn't officially exist sent me text messages about deliveries I never agreed to make. It sounded insane even in his own head, and he'd driven away both times without going inside. His wife had noticed the changes in him, the way he jumped whenever his phone buzzed, the increased frequency with which he checked his mirrors even when sitting at red lights in normal traffic. She'd asked him directly one evening over dinner if something was wrong, if he was in some kind of trouble, and he'd lied to her face with a smile that felt like broken glass in his mouth. Just tired from the long hauls, he'd said, thinking about maybe switching to local routes to spend more time at home. She'd been supportive, even enthusiastic about the idea, and her genuine happiness at the prospect of having him home more often had made him feel even worse about the deception. But how could he explain Dead Miners Crossing to her when he barely understood it himself? The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon in late November, when Hollis was hauling a load of construction materials from El Paso to Tucson. The route was straightforward. Interstate 10 the entire way, no detours or backroads, just smooth highway driving through familiar territory. He'd made this run probably 200 times over the years, knew every truck stop and way station, could practically drive it with his eyes closed. The weather was perfect for driving, clear skies and temperatures in the mid-70s, and he was making excellent time, ahead of schedule by nearly an hour. He'd been singing along to an old Johnny Cash song on the radio when his phone rang, the screen showing an unknown number that he almost didn't answer. Something made him pick up anyway, maybe curiosity or maybe just the foolish hope that it was a wrong number, someone looking for a different Hollis creed entirely. The voice that came through the speaker was female, older, with that thick southwestern accent that he'd heard once before in a diner that served coffee black as tar. "Hollis, it's Myrna Jo Tate from Dead Miners Crossing. Been trying to reach you for months now, but you keep ignoring our messages. That's rude, especially considering we gave you free fuel and a place to sleep when you needed it. Time to settle accounts, don't you think?" His first instinct was to hang up immediately, to throw the phone out the window and pretend the call had never happened. But his hands stayed on the wheel and his thumbs stayed away from the end call button, some part of him understanding that running wasn't going to work anymore. "I don't owe you anything," he said, keeping his voice steady even as his heart rate climbed toward the dangerous levels. "I didn't ask for the fuel and I paid for the room. We're square, so stop calling me and stop sending those messages. Find someone else to harass." Myrna Jo Tate's laugh came through the speaker, sharp and humorless. "Oh, sweetie, that's not how this works. You drove into our town, used our resources, learned things about our operation that we don't share with outsiders. That creates an obligation, whether you want to acknowledge it or not. We're a community built on mutual support, and now we need your support, simple as that." Her tone was conversational, almost friendly, but underneath it, Hollis could hear something harder, something that suggested this wasn't a request he could refuse. He checked his mirrors, an automatic response to feeling threatened, and found the highway behind him empty except for a distant sedan that posed no obvious danger. "What exactly do you think I can do for you? I'm a truck driver, not a smuggler. If you're running some kind of illegal mining operation, that's your business, but I'm not getting involved. Find someone desperate enough to take your money and leave me alone." He meant it to sound forceful, definitive, but even to his own ears it came out more pleading than commanding. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that Hollis thought she might have hung up, but then Myrna Jo Tate spoke again, her voice taking on a different quality, more businesslike, and less performatively pleasant. We have 3 packages that need to move from Dead Miners Crossing to a location in Arizona, outside of Kingman. You'll be passing within 50 miles of there in about 6 hours based on your current route. The packages are small, each one about the size of a shoebox, and they contain refined ore samples that need to reach a buyer who's expecting them Thursday morning. You pick them up, you deliver them, you get paid $5,000 cash for less than an hour of extra driving. That's the deal. $5,000 was more than Hollis made in a good month, enough to make him seriously consider the offer before his common sense kicked in and reminded him that nothing about Dead Miners Crossing had ever been legitimate or safe. "And if I say no?" he asked, already knowing he wouldn't like the answer. "What happens then? You keep calling me forever, or do you escalate to something more direct?" Myrna Jo Tate didn't answer the question directly, instead pivoting to something that made Hollis's blood run cold. "Your wife, that's Carolyn, right? Works at the public library in Phoenix, drives a blue Honda Accord, license plate starts with ADF. Your boys, Marcus and Derek, they go to Desert Vista Elementary, get out of school at 3:15 every weekday. Marcus is in 4th grade, Derek's in 2nd. They like to stop at the playground on their way to the bus, usually spend 10 or 15 minutes on the swings before heading home. Beautiful family you've got there, Hollis. Would be a shame if anything disrupted their nice, safe routine." The rage that flooded through him was so intense it made his vision narrow, and his hands gripped the steering wheel hard enough to make the leather creak. "You leave my family alone," he said, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. "They have nothing to do with this. You want me to deliver your packages, fine, I'll do it. But if I see anyone near my wife or my kids, if I even suspect you're watching them, I'll drive straight to the FBI and tell them everything I know about your operation. I'll burn your entire town to the ground, and I won't care what it costs me." Myrna Jo Tate's response was immediate and carried no trace of the earlier friendliness. "You do that, Hollis, and you'll never see your family again. Not because we'll hurt them, though we certainly could, but because you'll spend the rest of your life in a federal prison after we make sure the authorities find certain materials in your truck. Materials you didn't know were there, but that won't matter much to a jury. We've been doing this a long time, and we know how to protect ourselves. So let's skip the threats and get down to business. You pick up the packages tonight, you deliver them tomorrow morning, and then we're done. This one favor settles your obligation to Dead Miners Crossing, and you never hear from us again. That's the best deal you're going to get." Hollis drove in silence for nearly a mile, watching the white lines of the highway blur past while his mind raced through options that all ended badly. He could call the police right now, report the threat against his family, but then what? Would they take him seriously without any evidence? Would they be able to protect Carolyn and the boys against people who operated completely off the grid? And if Myrna Jo Tate was telling the truth about planting evidence in his truck, how could he prove his innocence? These people had his personal information, his routes, probably even access to his truck when he wasn't watching it. They'd had 6 months to set up whatever insurance policy they needed to keep him compliant. "When and where?" he asked finally, the words tasting like surrender. "And I want your word that this is the only thing you'll ever ask me to do. One delivery, and then you delete my information and pretend you never met me. That's the condition." It was a weak condition, unenforceable, and probably meaningless, but he needed to say it anyway. needed to maintain some illusion that he had any leverage in this situation. Myrna, Joe Tate's voice brightened immediately, the false friendliness returning like a mask sliding back into place. Smart decision. You'll exit Interstate 10 at mile marker 89. That's about 3 hours from your current position. Take the access road north for exactly 2.7 miles until you reach an abandoned gas station. Someone will be waiting there with the packages. Shouldn't take more than 5 minutes to load them. After your delivery in Tucson, you'll head north toward Kingman on Highway 93. There's a rest area at mile marker 142. Pull in there tomorrow morning around 7. Someone will approach your truck, you'll hand over the packages, and you'll drive away $5,000 richer. Simple, clean, over before you know it. Nothing about this situation felt simple or clean, but Hollis found himself agreeing anyway, confirming the details and memorizing the locations even as part of his brain screamed at him to find another way out. The call ended without any further pleasantries, and he was left alone in his cab with the sound of the diesel engine and the weight of what he'd just agreed to do pressing down on his chest like a physical thing. He thought about calling Carolyn, warning her to keep the boys close and watch for anyone suspicious, but what would he say that wouldn't terrify her? "Sorry, honey, I got mixed up with some criminals from a ghost town and now they might be watching our children?" That conversation would end with her calling the police herself, which might be the smart play, except for the threat of planted evidence that could destroy his life, even if it ultimately couldn't be proven. The 3 hours to mile marker 89 passed in a haze of anxiety and second-guessing, every mile marker another countdown to a decision he couldn't take back. The construction materials he was hauling suddenly felt like they weighed twice as much, dragging at his truck and making the whole rig feel sluggish and unwieldy. He stopped once at a rest area to use the bathroom and splash water on his face, checking his load and his truck for any signs of tampering, finding nothing, but also knowing that he probably wouldn't recognize signs of professional sabotage if he saw them. These people had been running their illegal operation for 50 years, according to Abner Holt, which meant they knew how to avoid detection and how to handle anyone who threatened their security. Mile marker 89 appeared in his headlights just after 8:30 in the evening, the exit ramp leading to a rural access road that looked like it hadn't been maintained in decades. He took the exit slowly, checking his mirrors for anyone following, and began the 2.7-mile drive north into darkness that felt thicker the farther he got from the interstate. The access road was barely wide enough for his truck, with desert scrub pressing in close on both sides and occasional potholes that jarred the entire rig when his wheels hit them. The abandoned gas station appeared exactly where Myrna Joe Tate had said it would be, a derelict structure with a collapsed canopy and empty windows that reflected his headlights like dead eyes. A pickup truck was parked beside the station, dark blue or maybe black, hard to tell in the limited light. As Hollis pulled his rig to a stop, leaving the engine running, the pickup's door opened and a figure climbed out. The person was male, average height, wearing jeans and a dark jacket with the hood pulled up to obscure his face. He walked to the back of the pickup, lowered the tailgate, and lifted out a cardboard box that looked like it had been sealed with excessive amounts of packing tape. The man carried the box to Hollis's truck and tapped on the passenger door with one knuckle. Hollis unlocked the door and pushed it open, and the man climbed up into the cab with the box balanced on one arm. Up close, with the cab's interior lights on, Hollis could see that the man's face was covered with a bandana pulled up to just below his eyes, leaving only a strip of skin and eyebrows visible. "3 packages," the man said, his voice muffled by the fabric. "They're fragile, so don't stack anything heavy on them and try to avoid rough roads. The buyer will inspect them before payment, so any damage comes out of your cut. Understood?" Hollis nodded, taking the box and setting it on the passenger seat. The weight was substantial, maybe 30 or 40 pounds total, and he could feel something shifting inside despite the careful packing. The man watched him handle the box with an intensity that suggested he was evaluating Hollis's competence, looking for any sign that this delivery might go wrong. Delivery location is the rest area at mile marker 142 on Highway 93, tomorrow morning at 7. Don't be late, don't be early, and don't open the packages. The buyer will know if you tampered with them, and the consequences for that would be severe. Any questions? Hollis had about 1,000 questions, starting with what exactly was in the packages and ending with how he'd gotten his life to a point where this seemed like a reasonable course of action. But he kept them all to himself, just shaking his head and watching as the man climbed back down from the cab and returned to his pickup. The truck's engine started immediately, headlights cutting through the darkness as it turned and drove back toward the access road, leaving Hollis alone with his cargo and his guilt. The drive to Tucson passed without incident, and he delivered his construction materials to the job site just after midnight, spending the required time watching the forklift operators unload his trailer while he filled out paperwork and tried not to think about the box sitting in his cab. His hands were shaking badly enough that his signature looked nothing like his usual neat script, and the job site supervisor asked if he was feeling all right, if maybe he needed to take a break before driving any further. Hollis assured him everything was fine, just tired from the long haul, and climbed back into his cab as soon as the trailer was empty and the paperwork was complete. He'd planned to grab a few hours of sleep at a truck stop before heading north to Kingman, but sleep felt impossible with the packages sitting 3 feet away from him, so he just started driving. Highway 93 was empty at this hour. Maybe a few scattered vehicles, but mostly just darkness and the occasional lights of small towns passing by on either side. His CB radio had been quiet since leaving Tucson, no chatter from other drivers, no weather updates or traffic warnings, just static and silence that made the cab feel even more isolated. He kept glancing at the box on his passenger seat, wondering what refined ore samples looked like, and whether that's really what he was carrying, or if Myrna Jo Tate had lied about the contents to make him more compliant. Mile marker 142 appeared in his headlights at 6:47 a.m., 13 minutes early, according to his dashboard clock. The rest area was one of those minimal facilities, just a parking lot with a few concrete picnic tables and a restroom building that looked like it had been constructed in the 1970s and never updated. No other vehicles were present when he pulled in, which made him nervous enough to consider driving past and abandoning the whole plan. But he knew that wouldn't solve anything, would only delay whatever consequences Myrna Jo Tate had planned for non-compliance. So he parked his rig in a spot with a clear view of the entrance and waited. The vehicle that pulled in at exactly 7 o'clock was a white cargo van, windowless and unmarked, the kind of vehicle that could belong to any contractor or delivery service. It parked 3 spots away from Hollis's truck, and the driver's door opened to reveal a woman in her 30s, blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing coveralls and work boots that looked genuinely used rather than performatively dirty. She walked directly to Hollis's passenger door and knocked twice, a businesslike sound that conveyed efficiency rather than aggression. Hollis handed her the box through the passenger window, and she took it without a word, carrying it back to her van and disappearing inside for maybe 2 minutes. When she emerged, she was holding a manila envelope that she brought back to his truck, passing it through the window with the same businesslike efficiency. "Count it if you want," she said, her voice neutral and unaccented. 5,000 in hundreds, non-sequential bills. Your obligation to Dead Miners Crossing is now fulfilled. Don't try to contact them, don't go looking for that town again, and don't talk to anyone about what you transported. This conversation never happened. She walked back to her van without waiting for a response, started the engine, and drove away, leaving Hollis sitting in the rest area parking lot with a manila envelope full of cash and the growing certainty that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. He opened the envelope and counted the money mechanically, finding exactly 50 $100 bills that looked and felt legitimate. $5,000 for less than 2 hours of extra driving and the complete compromise of whatever ethics he'd thought he possessed. He stuffed the envelope under his seat and sat there for a long time, watching the sun climb higher in the desert sky and trying to figure out what kind of person he'd become. The drive home to Phoenix took 4 hours, and when he walked through his front door just after noon, Carolyn was there with a smile that made him feel like the worst human being alive. She'd made his favorite lunch, meatloaf sandwiches with the thick-cut bread he loved, and the boys were at school, so they had the house to themselves for a few hours. They ate together at the kitchen table, and she told him about her week at the library, about the difficult patron who'd complained that the computers were too slow, and the elderly man who'd asked her to help him send an email to his granddaughter. Normal life, ordinary problems, everything he'd been risking with his decision to help Dead Miners Crossing. He didn't tell her about the delivery, didn't mention the $5,000 hidden in his truck, just listened to her talk and tried to appreciate what he had before it all came crashing down. Because despite what the woman in the van had said about his obligation being fulfilled, Hollis knew with absolute certainty that Dead Miners Crossing wasn't done with him. People who operated the way they did, who threatened families and planted evidence and ran illegal mines in ghost towns, those people didn't just let assets walk away after one successful job. They'd be back with another delivery or another favor, and each time it would get a little worse, a little more illegal until he was in so deep that there was no way out that didn't end with prison or worse. That evening, after Carolyn had gone to bed and the boys were asleep in their rooms, Hollis sat in his truck in the driveway and took out the manila envelope. He counted the money one more time, all $5,000 of it, and then he started his truck and drove to the nearest police station. He walked inside with the envelope in his hand and asked to speak with someone about illegal mining operations in New Mexico, and 3 hours later he'd told his entire story to a federal agent who specialized in interstate smuggling and organized crime. The agent, a woman named Vasquez with tired eyes and a wedding ring she twisted while she talked, listened to everything without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad in handwriting so neat it looked printed. When Hollis finished, she sat back in her chair and studied him for a long moment before speaking. "This town, Dead Miners Crossing, we've heard rumors about it for years but never been able to confirm its location. If what you're telling me is accurate, you may have just given us the break we need to shut down a major illegal operation. But I need you to understand the position you're in. You've already transported their materials, which makes you complicit in whatever crimes they're committing. The best way forward is to cooperate fully, which means wearing a wire on your next contact with them and helping us gather enough evidence for prosecution." Hollis had expected this, had spent the entire drive to the police station preparing himself for the reality that cooperation meant more danger, not less. But he also knew it was the only path that didn't end with him looking over his shoulder forever, waiting for Dead Miners Crossing to pull him deeper into their operation. He agreed to everything Agent Vasquez proposed, signing papers that made him officially an informant, and accepting the small recording device she gave him with instructions to keep it on his person at all times. The problem, of course, was that Dead Miners Crossing never contacted him again. 3 weeks passed in agonizing silence. Hollis continued his regular routes, the wire that Agent Vasquez had given him pressed against his chest under his shirt every single day, recording nothing but the monotonous sounds of highway driving and his own increasingly anxious breathing. He checked his phone obsessively, expecting messages from unknown numbers that never came. His CB radio stayed quiet except for the usual trucker chatter about weather and speed traps. It was as if Dead Miners Crossing had simply evaporated from existence the moment he'd decided to cooperate with federal authorities, which struck him as impossible and deeply unsettling in equal measure. Agent Vasquez called him twice during those 3 weeks, her voice carrying a professional frustration that suggested she was beginning to doubt his story. The first call was perfunctory, just checking that his equipment was working and reminding him to document any contact attempts. The second call, which came on a Friday evening while he was having dinner with his family, carried a different tone entirely. She asked him to come to the federal building the following Monday, said there were some inconsistencies in his account that needed clarification. The word inconsistencies hung in the air like an accusation, and Hollis had spent the entire weekend trying to figure out what exactly she meant by that. Monday's meeting started badly and got progressively worse. Agent Vasquez had brought 2 other people with her, both men in dark suits who introduced themselves with names Hollis immediately forgot and titles that included words like investigator and compliance. They sat across from him in a windowless conference room that smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet, and the first thing they did was place a manila folder on the table between them. Agent Vasquez opened it with careful deliberation, revealing photographs that made Hollis's stomach drop like he'd hit an air pocket at 30,000 feet. The first photograph showed the abandoned gas station where he'd picked up the packages, but in daylight rather than the darkness he'd seen it in. The structure looked even more derelict in the harsh desert sun, with obvious signs of long-term abandonment, including caved-in walls and vegetation growing through cracks in the concrete pad. The second photograph showed tire tracks in the dirt around the station, presumably from his truck, but also showing that no other vehicles had been there recently. The dirt was undisturbed except for his marks. No sign of the blue pickup that had delivered the packages to him. Agent Vasquez tapped the photograph with one manicured fingernail. "We sent a team to this location based on your description. Found your tire tracks exactly where you said you'd parked, but found no evidence of any other vehicle. No footprints, no disturbed dirt where a pickup would have parked, nothing. The building itself hasn't been accessed in years according to the dust patterns inside. So, help me understand how someone met you there and handed you packages when all the physical evidence suggests you were alone." Hollis stared at the photographs, his mind racing to make sense of what he was seeing. He remembered the pickup truck clearly, remembered the man with the bandana covering his face, remembered the weight of the box being passed through his window. Those memories were solid, detailed, impossible to have imagined. "I don't know how to explain the lack of evidence," he said slowly, trying to keep his voice steady. "But I know what happened. Someone was there, someone gave me packages, and I drove them to the rest area like I told you. Maybe they swept the area afterward, covered their tracks somehow. These people have been operating for 50 years. They obviously know how to avoid detection." One of the men in suits leaned forward, his expression skeptical in a way that suggested he'd heard plenty of lies in his career and had Hollis categorized as just another one. "Let's talk about this rest area then. Mile marker 142 on Highway 93, you said. We sent agents there as well, interviewed the maintenance staff who service that facility. They review security footage regularly because of vandalism issues, and guess what they found when they checked the recordings from the date you specified?" He paused for effect, clearly enjoying the theatrical moment. "Your truck pulling in at 6:47 a.m., sitting alone in the parking lot for approximately 15 minutes, and then leaving. No white cargo van, no woman in coveralls, nobody approaching your vehicle at all. You sat there by yourself for a quarter of an hour, and then drove away." The conference room felt like it was shrinking, walls pressing inward while Hollis tried to process information that directly contradicted his lived experience. He could remember the woman's face, remember her blonde ponytail and the efficiency of her movements, remember the manila envelope being passed through his window. The memory was crystal clear, detailed enough that he could recall the small scar on her left hand and the way her coveralls had oil stains near the right pocket. "That's impossible," he said. knowing how weak it sounded even as the words left his mouth. "I saw her. I talked to her. She gave me $5,000 that I turned over to Agent Vasquez. That money had to come from somewhere." Agent Vasquez pulled another photograph from the folder, this one showing a stack of $100 bills on what looked like a laboratory table. "About that money. We had it analyzed by our forensics team, and the results were interesting. The bills are genuine, not counterfeit, but they're also old. Very old. Based on the printing techniques and serial number patterns, our experts date them to somewhere between 1963 and 1967. They've been in circulation for decades, which explains their worn condition, but it raises questions about where you actually obtained them. Most criminal organizations use recent bills specifically to avoid this kind of age-based tracking." The dates hit Hollis like a physical blow. 1963 to 1967, right around the time the mine had supposedly closed and the company had supposedly abandoned Dead Miners Crossing. The coins in that cloth bag they'd left on his windshield had been from the 1960s as well, which couldn't be coincidence. These people were using money that had been printed during the mine's operational period, which suggested either an enormous cash stockpile that had remained hidden for 50 years, or something else entirely. Something that Hollis's rational mind refused to fully consider. The other suited man pulled out yet another photograph. This one showing a satellite image of the area where State Route 152 ran through the New Mexico desert. He'd marked the image with a red circle, highlighting a section of terrain that looked completely undeveloped, just empty desert and rock formations. "This is where you claim Dead Miners Crossing is located, based on the GPS data from your truck's onboard system. We've reviewed satellite imagery from the past 20 years, and there's never been any settlement in this area. No buildings, no roads, no infrastructure of any kind. What you're describing simply doesn't exist, and never has, at least not according to any records we can find." Hollis felt the ground shifting under him, his entire understanding of reality beginning to crack like ice under too much weight. He'd been there, had walked through that town, had fueled his truck at that ancient pump and slept in that decrepit boarding house. Those experiences had been real, tangible, impossible to have hallucinated in such complete detail. "I'm not crazy," he said, though even to his own ears the statement sounded defensive and uncertain. "I know what I saw. That town exists, those people are real, and they threatened my family to force me into making that delivery. You have to believe me." Agent Vasquez closed the folder and folded her hands on top of it, her expression shifting from professional skepticism to something that might have been concern or might have been pity. "Hollis, I want to believe you. I really do. But everything we've found suggests that you spent approximately 6 hours driving through the New Mexico desert with no clear record of where you went, that you met with people at locations where security footage and physical evidence show you were alone, and that you're now in possession of 50-year-old currency that you can't explain. From our perspective, this looks like either a psychological episode or an elaborate story designed to cover up something else entirely. Either way, we can't move forward with an investigation based on evidence that doesn't exist and testimony that contradicts all available facts." The meeting ended shortly after that, with Agent Vasquez suggesting that Hollis take some time off from driving, maybe see someone about the stress he was obviously under. They kept the $5,000 as evidence, though evidence of what remained unclear, and they kept the wire as well, suggesting that he wouldn't be needing it anymore. The federal building's elevator ride down to the parking garage felt like descending into some kind of bureaucratic hell, and when Hollis reached his truck, he sat in the driver's seat for a full 20 minutes, trying to decide if he was losing his mind or if something far worse was happening. He started the engine finally and drove home, where Carolyn was waiting with questions about how the meeting had gone. He lied again, told her everything was fine. Just a routine follow-up about some suspicious activity he'd witnessed. She accepted the explanation without much scrutiny, and they spent the evening watching television with the boys, normal family activities that felt increasingly surreal, given everything Hollis was trying to process. That night, lying in bed while Carolyn slept beside him, he stared at the ceiling and tried to remember every detail of Dead Miners Crossing, testing his memories for any signs of fabrication or delusion. They all felt real, solid, impossible to dismiss as imagination or stress-induced hallucination. The text message came at 2:37 a.m., the phone's vibration on his nightstand pulling him from the shallow sleep he'd finally managed to achieve. Unknown number, as always, but the message was longer than usual and carried a tone that was almost friendly, almost sympathetic. "Hollis, we know you went to the authorities." That was disappointing, but not unexpected. Some people need to learn the hard way that certain things exist outside normal channels of verification. The federal agents will never find Dead Miners Crossing because it doesn't want to be found, and you'll never be able to prove you were here because we don't leave evidence for outsiders. But you know the truth, and that knowledge creates a permanent connection. Your obligation isn't finished. It's only just beginning. Watch your routes carefully. We'll see you again when the time is right. Hollis deleted the message immediately, then checked to make sure the deletion had actually worked, a compulsive habit he'd developed over the past months. He considered waking Carolyn, showing her the phone, explaining everything in detail, including his growing fear that Dead Miners Crossing operated according to rules that normal law enforcement couldn't touch. But what good would that do except transfer his anxiety to her, make her as paranoid and sleep-deprived as he'd become? Instead, he got out of bed quietly and went downstairs to the kitchen, where he made coffee and sat at the table watching the darkness outside slowly give way to dawn. The weeks that followed settled into a new kind of normal, one where Hollis continued driving his routes but with a constant low-grade fear that never fully dissipated. He avoided State Route 152 completely, routing around that entire section of New Mexico even when it added significant time and mileage to his trips. His dispatcher complained repeatedly about the inefficiency, and eventually Hollis had to sit down with the company owner and explain that he had personal reasons for avoiding that area, reasons he couldn't fully articulate. The owner, a man named Pritchard, who'd been running the company for 30 years, studied Hollis with eyes that suggested he'd seen his share of troubled drivers, and eventually agreed to assign him routes that stayed clear of that region. The text messages continued sporadically, never frequent enough to establish a pattern, but regular enough to prevent Hollis from forgetting about Dead Miners Crossing. They were usually brief, just coordinates or cryptic phrases like "next month" or "soon" or "don't forget us." He'd stopped showing them to anyone after Agent Vasquez had made it clear the federal government considered his entire story unreliable at best and delusional at worst. Some of the messages included photographs, always taken from a distance but clearly showing Hollis or his family. His truck at various stops, Carolyn walking into the library, the boys playing at school. The implication was obvious. We're watching. We can reach you whenever we want. Your cooperation isn't optional. 6 months after his meeting with the federal agents, Hollis was hauling a load of electronics from Los Angeles to Albuquerque, a route he'd driven hundreds of times. The trip was routine until he reached the section of Interstate 40 that passed within 50 miles of where Dead Miners Crossing supposedly existed. His CB radio, which had been carrying the usual trucker chatter about traffic and weather, suddenly went silent. Not static, not interference, just complete dead air, as if every other driver on the highway had simultaneously stopped transmitting. He checked his radio to make sure it was still powered on, found it functioning normally, and keyed the mic to test it. "Anyone out there?" he called into the silence. This is southbound traffic on I-40, requesting radio check. Nothing came back. Not even static. Just that oppressive silence that made the cab feel isolated from the rest of the world. He tried several more times with the same result, and was about to give up when a voice came through the speaker, female and familiar and absolutely unwelcome. "Hello, Hollis. It's been too long. We've been very patient, letting you think you'd escaped, but patience has its limits. There's an exit coming up in 12 miles, mile marker 117. Take it. Someone will be waiting with new instructions. And Hollis, don't make us repeat the threats about your family. You know we're serious, and you know the authorities can't protect you from something they don't believe exists. See you soon." The transmission ended as abruptly as it had begun, and immediately the CB radio came back to life with normal trucker chatter, as if the past several minutes of silence had never happened. Hollis checked his dashboard GPS and confirmed that mile marker 117 was indeed 12 miles ahead, an exit he'd never used before that led to what the map showed as empty desert. His hands were shaking badly enough that he had to grip the steering wheel tighter to maintain control, and his mind was racing through options that all seemed equally terrible. He could ignore the instruction, drive straight through to Albuquerque and hope that Dead Miners Crossing was bluffing about the consequences. He could pull over immediately and call the police, report a threat against his family even knowing they probably wouldn't take it seriously. He could take the exit as instructed and see what these people wanted, gambling that cooperation would eventually lead to freedom rather than deeper entanglement. None of these options felt safe. None felt like they led anywhere good, but he had to choose something. Mile marker 117 appeared in his headlights, the exit sign showing nothing but a generic symbol indicating a paved road leading into undeveloped territory. Hollis's turn signal clicked rhythmically as he moved into the right lane, the sound marking off seconds while he made his decision. The exit ramp was coming up fast, maybe 200 feet away, and his foot hovered over the brake pedal while his mind screamed contradictory instructions. At the last possible moment, he jerked the wheel hard to the right and took the exit, the truck's momentum carrying him down the ramp and onto a narrow 2-lane road that stretched into darkness. The road was empty, no other vehicles in sight, and his headlights revealed nothing but desert scrub and the occasional reflective marker showing the road's edge. He drove for exactly 3 miles, following the road as it wound through terrain that looked identical in every direction, before his headlights caught something that made him slam on the brakes hard enough to engage the truck's anti-lock system. Standing in the middle of the road, perfectly centered between the white lines, was Abner Holt. The old man looked exactly as Hollis remembered him. Same denim overalls, same pale blue eyes that reflected the truck's headlights like an animal's. He stood perfectly still, arms at his sides, making no move to get out of the way. Hollis sat there with his engine idling, staring at the figure in his headlights and trying to decide if this was real or if he'd finally crossed the line into complete psychological breakdown. After maybe 30 seconds, Abner Holt raised one hand in a gesture that was half wave and half summons, then turned and walked off the road into the desert darkness. Hollis knew he should drive away, should gun the engine and get back to the interstate as fast as his loaded truck could manage. But something compelled him to set the parking brake and climb down from the cab, flashlight in hand, following the old man into the darkness like a child following a stranger offering candy. The desert floor was rough under his boots, covered in rocks and low-growing plants that grabbed at his pant legs. Abner Holt stayed maybe 20 feet ahead of him, visible only as a moving shadow that occasionally reflected Hollis's flashlight beam. They walked for what felt like miles, but was probably only a few hundred yards, and then the terrain dropped away suddenly into a shallow valley that Hollis was certain hadn't been visible from the road. At the bottom of that valley sat Dead Miners Crossing, every building lit up like it was the middle of the day, people moving between structures with the same organized efficiency he'd witnessed that first night. His truck sat on the road behind him, headlights still blazing, close enough that he should be able to see it from this vantage point. But when he turned to look back, there was nothing but darkness and empty desert. His truck vanished as completely as if it had never existed. Abner Holt stood at the edge of the valley, his expression unreadable in the strange light emanating from the town below. "Welcome back, Hollis. We knew you'd return eventually. They always do, once they've seen what we really are. The federal agents will never find this place because it exists in the spaces between what maps can show and what satellites can photograph. We're real, but we're also not real in any way that matters to people who trust their evidence more than their experience. You made one delivery for us, and that created a connection that can't be severed by distance or denial. You're part of Dead Miners Crossing now, whether you want to be or not." The old man turned and started walking down into the valley, his pace steady and unhurried, clearly expecting Hollis to follow. And despite every instinct screaming at him to run, to find his truck and drive until he reached civilization, Hollis found his feet moving forward, following Abner Holt down toward the lights of the town that shouldn't exist. As he descended, he could see faces looking up at him from the streets below. Myrna Jo Tate, standing in her diner doorway, other people he recognized from his first visit, all watching his approach with expressions that might have been satisfaction or might have been hunger. Hollis never made his delivery to Albuquerque. His truck was found 3 days later on that empty desert road, engine still running, headlights blazing, the load of electronics intact and undisturbed. The driver's door was hanging open, his phone sitting on the seat with the last received message still displayed, coordinates that led to nothing but empty desert. Search teams combed the area for a week, finding no signs of struggle, no footprints leading away from the vehicle, no evidence of what had happened to him. Agent Vasquez attended the press conference where local authorities announced that the search was being scaled back, and she stood at the back of the room remembering a trucker who'd told her an impossible story about a ghost town that didn't exist. She'd written him off as disturbed or delusional, had dismissed his warnings about people who operated outside normal channels of verification. Now his truck sat in an evidence lot, and his family was planning a memorial service for a man whose body would never be found. The case remained open but unsolved, filed away with dozens of other missing person reports from that stretch of New Mexico desert. Occasionally, other truckers would report strange encounters, messages from unknown numbers, towns that appeared on roads and vanished before they could be verified. The reports were always dismissed, always explained away as stress or exhaustion or GPS errors. But in the files that Agent Vasquez kept in her desk drawer, there was a growing collection of incidents that all shared certain details: old currency, impossible coordinates, and the name Dead Miners Crossing appearing in testimonies that official records claimed couldn't be real. And somewhere in the New Mexico desert, in a town that exists only when it chooses to be found, Hollis Creed was learning what it meant to be permanently connected to something that lived in the spaces between maps and reality. The work was hard, the hours were long, and the pay was in currency printed before most people currently alive had been born. But the alternative, whatever that might have been, was no longer available to him. Dead Miners Crossing took care of its own, and once you became part of that family, you belonged to it forever. Rayford Keene had been driving the same route between Phoenix and Flagstaff for 9 years when his fuel gauge started acting strange that September afternoon in 2019. The needle had been sitting comfortably at half full when he'd checked it during his last rest stop. But now, barely 40 minutes later, it was hovering just above the quarter tank mark and dropping visibly as he watched. He tapped the gauge with his knuckle. a useless gesture he'd performed countless times over his 17 years of driving trucks, and watched the needle dip even lower in response, as if his touch had somehow accelerated whatever malfunction was causing the problem. The sun was starting its descent toward the western horizon, painting the Arizona desert in shades of orange and gold that would have been beautiful if Rayford hadn't been preoccupied with calculating whether he could reach the next fuel stop before running completely dry. His Peterbilt was hauling refrigerated produce, 28,000 pounds of lettuce and tomatoes destined for grocery distribution centers in Flagstaff, and the reefer unit on his trailer was running constantly to keep everything at the required 34 degrees. The unit consumed fuel at a steady rate that Rayford had learned to factor into his trip planning. But even accounting for that drain, the gauge shouldn't be dropping this fast. He checked his trip computer, which showed he'd burned through nearly 60 gallons in the past hour, almost triple his normal consumption rate. Either he had a fuel leak that was dumping diesel onto the highway behind him, or the gauge itself was malfunctioning and showing him incorrect information. Neither option was good, but a leak was actively dangerous and expensive, while a faulty gauge was merely inconvenient. He pulled onto the shoulder carefully, checking his mirrors to make sure no traffic was approaching, and climbed down from the cab with his flashlight already in hand, even though the daylight was still strong enough to see clearly. The air hit him like opening an oven door, easily over 100 degrees, and within seconds he could feel sweat forming on his forehead and soaking into the collar of his shirt. He did a walk-around inspection of the truck, checking under the chassis for any signs of dripping fuel or wet spots on the pavement that would indicate an active leak. Everything looked dry, the ground beneath his truck showing nothing but dust and the occasional dried weed. The fuel tanks themselves were intact, no visible damage or loose fittings, and the fuel lines running from the tanks to the engine showed no signs of wear or rupture. Rayford climbed back into the cab and checked the gauge again, watching with growing concern as the needle continued its steady descent toward empty. The trip computer was now showing 70 gallons consumed, which was physically impossible given the time that had elapsed and the distance he'd traveled. Something was definitely wrong with the instrumentation, which meant he couldn't trust any of the readings his dashboard was showing him. He might have plenty of fuel, or he might be running on fumes, and there was no reliable way to determine which without physically checking the tank levels, something that would require tools he didn't carry and expertise he didn't possess. The next official fuel stop, according to his GPS, was 63 miles ahead, a truck plaza on the outskirts of Flagstaff that he'd used dozens of times before. Under normal circumstances, that would be an easy drive, maybe an hour at highway speeds, but with an unreliable fuel gauge and no way to know his actual fuel status, 63 miles suddenly felt like crossing an ocean in a rowboat. He could try to limp there and hope he made it, or he could look for alternatives closer to his current position. He pulled up the map on his phone, zooming in on the area surrounding his location, and found mostly empty desert with a few unnamed roads branching off the main highway. One road, about 8 miles ahead, showed a small symbol that might have been a gas station, or might have been an error in the map data. The notation beside it read, "Service status unknown," which wasn't particularly encouraging, but 8 miles was better than 63 if his fuel situation was as bad as the gauge suggested. Rayford made his decision, started the engine, and pulled back onto the highway, keeping his speed lower than usual to conserve whatever fuel he might have left. The 8 miles passed slowly, each minute feeling stretched thin by anxiety, and he found himself checking the gauge compulsively even though he knew the readings were unreliable. The exit appeared exactly where the map had indicated, marked by a faded green sign that was missing most of its reflective coating. The sign had once displayed text, but weather and time had worn it down to nothing but ghost letters that might have spelled anything. Rayford took the exit and found himself on a 2-lane road that looked like it hadn't been maintained in decades. The asphalt was cracked and potholed, with desert sand drifting across the surface in patterns that suggested very few vehicles used this route anymore. He followed the road for approximately 3 miles, the landscape on either side becoming progressively more desolate. Nothing but scrub brush and rock formations that looked like they'd been sculpted by wind and time into abstract shapes. The gas station materialized out of the desert haze like a mirage gaining substance. It sat alone beside the road, a small building constructed from cinder blocks that had been painted white at some point, but had faded to a dirty gray. 2 fuel pumps stood under a metal canopy, the kind of old-fashioned pumps that predated digital displays and credit card readers, with mechanical number wheels visible through small windows on their faces. Behind the main building stood what looked like a garage bay with its roll-up door closed, and beside that was a smaller structure that might have been storage or living quarters. No signs were visible indicating the station's name or whether it was even operational, and the entire property had an abandoned quality that made Rayford seriously question whether he'd find any fuel here at all. He pulled his truck alongside the pumps and killed the engine, the sudden silence almost shocking after hours of diesel rumble and road noise. The heat pressed in immediately, turning the cab into an oven within seconds. Rayford sat there for a moment, studying the station through his windshield and trying to decide if this place was worth investigating, or if he should cut his losses and try to reach the Flagstaff Truck Plaza on whatever fuel he might have remaining. The building's windows were dark, not the darkness of closed blinds, but the deeper darkness of spaces that hadn't seen light in years. The door, painted the same faded gray as the walls, stood slightly ajar, a gap of maybe 2 inches showing nothing but shadow beyond. Movement caught his eye near the garage bay. A man emerged from around the corner of the building, wiping his hands on a rag that looked like it had once been red, but was now mostly black with oil and grime. The man was maybe in his late 50s, tall and lean, with skin weathered dark brown by sun exposure and wearing coveralls that were in slightly better condition than his cleaning rag. He had iron gray hair cut military short, and a face that was all hard angles and suspicious eyes. He looked at Rayford's truck with an expression that suggested he wasn't pleased to see visitors but had expected them anyway. Rayford opened his door and climbed down, his boots hitting the cracked concrete pad with a sound that seemed too loud in the desert quiet. "Afternoon," he called out, trying for friendly but landing somewhere closer to cautious. "Having some fuel gauge issues. Not sure if I'm running low or if my instrumentation's gone bad. You still selling diesel here?" He gestured toward the pumps, which looked like they hadn't been used since the Reagan administration. The man approached slowly, still working that rag between his hands like worry beads. Up close, Rayford could see that his coveralls had a name patch sewn above the left breast pocket, the kind mechanics wore, though the name was too faded to read clearly. Might have been Eldon, or maybe Edison, the letters worn down to suggestions rather than certainties. "Station's closed," the man said, his voice rough like he didn't use it much. "Been closed for about 6 years now, ever since the highway got rerouted and traffic stopped coming through. But the pumps still work if you're desperate, and from the look of your gauge situation, I'd say you qualify as desperate." Rayford followed the man's gaze to his truck's side panel, where the fuel tank gauge showed a reading he couldn't see from his current position. "How can you tell I've got gauge problems?" he asked, genuinely curious about what had given him away so quickly. The man, who Rayford was mentally calling Eldon until he learned otherwise, pointed at the truck with his rag-wrapped hand. "Because your tanks are full. Can see it from here, the way your rig's sitting level and the lack of sway when you pulled in. Loaded truck with full tanks has a certain look to it, and yours has that look. But you wouldn't be stopping at a closed station in the middle of nowhere unless you thought you were running empty, which means your gauge is lying to you. Seen it before, electrical problem usually, some short in the sending unit that makes the gauge read low even when you're topped off. That made sense. More sense than anything Rayford had been able to figure out on his own, and he felt some of his anxiety ease slightly. If his tanks were actually full, he could make Flagstaff easily and get the gauge fixed there by a proper mechanic. "Appreciate the diagnosis," he said, pulling his wallet from his back pocket. "What do I owe you for the information? Seems only fair to pay for your expertise even if I don't need fuel." Eldon waved the offer away with his rag, the gesture dismissive. "Don't need your money, but if you've got time, I could use some help with something. Got a delivery that came in about 2 weeks ago. Guy dropped off a compressor that's too heavy for me to move by myself. Been sitting in the storage building ever since, and I need to get it into the garage bay to install it. Figure a truck driver's probably used to handling heavy equipment, and if you could spare 20 minutes, I'd consider us even for the gauge advice." Rayford checked his watch, calculating the time against his delivery schedule. He was already running ahead of schedule by about 40 minutes, which gave him some cushion to work with. 20 minutes of physical labor in 100-degree heat wasn't his ideal afternoon activity, but it seemed like a fair trade for the peace of mind of knowing his fuel situation wasn't actually a crisis. "Sure," he said, tucking his wallet away. "Lead the way. Where's this compressor?" Eldon's expression shifted slightly, not quite a smile, but close, more like satisfaction at a problem about to be solved. "Storage building around back. Fair warning, place is a mess. Haven't organized it since the station closed, just been throwing stuff in there whenever I acquire something. You'll need to watch your step, lot of equipment and parts scattered around." He started walking toward the rear of the property, and Rayford followed, already regretting his decision as the afternoon heat seemed to intensify with each step. The storage building was smaller than Rayford had expected, maybe 20 feet by 30, with walls made from the same cinder blocks as the main station. The door was propped open with a chunk of concrete, and the interior was exactly as chaotic as Eldon had warned. Metal shelving units lined the walls, every surface covered with automotive parts, tools, and equipment in various states of repair and disrepair. The floor was navigable only via narrow paths between stacked boxes, plastic bins, and loose items that looked like they'd been dropped wherever there was space. The air inside was stifling, trapped heat with no ventilation, and it smelled like motor oil, dust, and something else, something organic and unpleasant that Rayford couldn't immediately identify. Eldon pointed toward the back corner where a large piece of equipment sat on a wooden pallet. "That's the compressor. Needs to go into the garage bay so I can mount it and run the lines. Should be manageable between the two of us if we take it slow and don't try anything heroic." He grabbed one end of the pallet while Rayford positioned himself at the other end, and together they lifted, finding the weight substantial but not impossibly heavy. The compressor itself was industrial grade, probably 300 pounds of cast iron and steel, and it shifted slightly on the pallet as they began the awkward process of carrying it out of the storage building. The path from storage to garage was maybe 50 feet, but it felt like 50 miles in the desert heat. Rayford's shirt was soaked through within the first 10 feet, sweat stinging his eyes and making his grip on the pallet uncertain. Eldon moved with practiced efficiency, his breathing steady and his pace measured, clearly accustomed to this kind of physical labor in extreme conditions. They reached the garage bay without incident, and Eldon kicked the door's release mechanism with one boot, causing the roll-up door to begin its slow ascent with a grinding sound that suggested the mechanism needed lubrication. The garage interior was cooler than outside, though not by much, and considerably darker. The space was a single bay, maybe 15 feet wide and twice that deep, with a workbench along one wall covered in tools and parts. An old truck, maybe from the 1980s based on its styling, sat on blocks in the center of the bay, its hood removed and engine partially disassembled. Oil stains covered the concrete floor in patterns that suggested decades of automotive work, and the walls were decorated with calendars from various years, all showing women in various states of undress alongside automotive equipment. The newest calendar Rayford could see was from 2013, which aligned with Eldon's claim that the station had been closed for 6 years. They set the compressor down near the workbench, and Rayford straightened up, his back complaining about the awkward lifting position. "Where did you want this mounted?" he asked, looking around for any obvious installation points. The garage had compressed air lines running along the ceiling, capped at regular intervals, clearly designed for a shop compressor to supply them with pressure. The existing compressor, much smaller and older, sat in the corner looking like it hadn't functioned in years. Eldon pulled a wheeled dolly from under the workbench and positioned it beside the pallet. "Going to replace the old one eventually, but first I need to test this new unit, make sure it's not damaged. Help me get it up on this dolly and we'll roll it to the test area." Together, they lifted the compressor again, this time only a few inches, and slid it onto the dolly with careful precision. Eldon wheeled it toward the back of the garage, where a section of floor had been painted with yellow safety stripes and equipped with what looked like testing equipment, gauges and valves and electrical connections. Rayford followed, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, and watched as Eldon began connecting cables and hoses with practiced movements. The mechanic worked in silence, his attention completely focused on the task, and Rayford took the opportunity to look around the garage more carefully. Something about the space felt off, though he couldn't immediately identify what was triggering his unease. The tools were organized, the work area was functional despite the dust and age, but there was something about the way certain items were positioned that seemed deliberate, staged even, like a movie set designed to look like a working garage rather than an actual working garage. The calendar from 2013 caught his attention again, and he walked over to examine it more closely. The image showed a woman posing with a classic Corvette, and the calendar's page was still turned to August, as if someone had stopped updating it mid-month and never bothered to continue. 6 years ago would have been 2013, which matched Eldon's timeline for when the station closed, but Rayford found it strange that the calendar would be left on the exact month of closure. Most people either took their calendars down or just left them to show whatever random month they happened to be on when they stopped caring. "You find something interesting?" Eldon's voice came from directly behind him, close enough to make Rayford jump slightly. The mechanic had moved with surprising stealth for someone wearing heavy boots on concrete, and now stood maybe 3 feet away with an expression that might have been curious or might have been something else entirely. Rayford stepped back instinctively, creating more space between them. "Just looking at your calendar, noticed it's from August 2013. That when you closed down?" He tried to keep his tone casual, conversational, but his instincts were screaming at him now that something was wrong with this entire situation. The garage was too staged. Eldon was too helpful for someone who claimed to be retired from the business, and the compressor delivery story didn't quite make sense when Rayford thought about it. Who delivers equipment to a closed gas station in the middle of nowhere? Eldon's expression remained neutral, but his eyes had taken on a harder quality, calculating rather than friendly. August 14th, 2013 to be exact. Highway Department finished their rerouting project and traffic stopped coming past here overnight. Literally, overnight, one day I had customers, the next day nothing but empty road. Station couldn't survive on zero business, so I shut it down and figured I'd just maintain the property until I decided what to do with it. Been maintaining it ever since, though I'm not sure why anymore. Habit, probably, or maybe just because I don't have anywhere else to be. The date, August 14th, meant something, Rayford was certain, though he couldn't immediately recall what. It nagged at the back of his mind like a forgotten appointment, and he made a mental note to look it up once he got back on the road. "Well, thanks for the help with the diagnosis," he said, moving toward the garage bay door with deliberate casualness. "I should probably get back on the highway. Still got a delivery to make in Flagstaff before nightfall. Appreciate your time." Eldon didn't move to stop him, but he didn't move aside either, remaining positioned between Rayford and the door. "You know, it's funny," he said, his voice taking on a reflective quality. "You're the first person to stop here in about 3 months. Used to be I'd get maybe 1 or 2 lost drivers a year, people whose GPS sent them the wrong way or who took the exit by mistake. But lately, it's been picking up. More people finding this place, almost like something's drawing them here. You believe in that kind of thing? Places that pull people in for a reason." Rayford's hand moved instinctively toward his pocket where his phone was stored, a reflexive gesture seeking the security of connection to the outside world. "Can't say that I do," he replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline now flooding his system. "I'm here because my gauge was acting up and your station happened to be close. Pure coincidence, nothing mystical about it." He moved to step around Eldon, trying to reach the door without making the movement seem like fleeing. The mechanic shifted position, blocking the path without making it obvious, his body language casual but his placement deliberate. "Thing is, your gauge isn't broken. I lied about that. Your tanks are actually almost empty, maybe 5 gallons left if you're lucky. You're not going to make it to Flagstaff, not even close. You're going to run dry somewhere between here and there, probably in one of the stretches with no cell service and no other traffic. And when that happens, when you're sitting on the side of the road with an empty tank and a load of produce starting to warm up because your reefer unit can't run without fuel, you're going to remember this conversation and wish you'd made different choices." The garage suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in, and Rayford's hand closed around his phone in his pocket, thumb finding the power button by muscle memory. "Why would you lie about that?" he asked, genuinely wanting to understand even as every instinct told him to stop talking and start running. "What possible reason would you have for sending me back out there knowing I'll run out of fuel?" Eldon smiled, and the expression contained no warmth whatsoever, just a cold satisfaction that made Rayford's spine go rigid with fear. Because people who run out of fuel come back. They always come back, looking for help, willing to accept whatever terms necessary to get their trucks running again. And when they come back, they find documents, papers that explain things, records that shouldn't exist but do. And once they've read those documents, once they know what happened here, they can't leave. They become part of the story, whether they want to or not. Rayford pulled his phone out and held it up, showing Eldon the screen. "I'm calling for a tow truck right now, and then I'm calling the highway patrol. Whatever game you're playing, it's over." He unlocked his phone and pulled up his contacts, but before he could dial, Eldon spoke again. "No signal here. Never has been. Not since the station closed. Something about the geography, or maybe the equipment I've got running in the basement, blocks all cellular communication for about a mile in every direction. You're welcome to try, of course, but you'll just waste time confirming what I already know." He stepped aside finally, gesturing toward the open garage door with mock politeness. "You're free to leave whenever you want. I'm not keeping you here, but you'll be back within the hour, empty tank and desperate for fuel, and when you return, we'll have a different conversation. One where you're more willing to listen and less concerned with calling for help that isn't coming." Rayford walked past him quickly, not quite running but moving faster than a casual exit would justify. The desert heat hit him like a wall as he emerged from the garage, and he covered the distance to his truck in long strides that ate up ground while his mind raced through options. The mechanic didn't follow him, just stood in the garage doorway watching with that same cold satisfaction, arms crossed over his chest. Rayford climbed into his cab, started the engine, and checked his fuel gauge immediately. The needle still showed near empty, but now he didn't know if that was accurate or if Eldon had been lying about lying. His trip computer showed no data, the screen blank like it had been reset or disconnected. He put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the broken asphalt road, checking his mirrors to see Eldon still standing in the garage doorway, growing smaller with distance but never quite disappearing entirely. The road back to the highway felt longer than it had coming in. Every minute stretched thin by uncertainty and fear. Rayford kept one eye on the fuel gauge and one eye on the road, trying to calculate distances and consumption rates in his head, trying to determine if he could make it to Flagstaff or if Eldon's prediction would come true. The highway appeared ahead, familiar and reassuring, and Rayford took the on-ramp faster than was strictly safe, desperate to put distance between himself and that station. His engine ran smoothly, no signs of fuel starvation, and he started to believe that maybe Eldon had been bluffing, that maybe his tanks really were full, and this whole encounter had just been some kind of psychological game played by a lonely mechanic with too much time and not enough human contact. The engine died 17 miles later, right in the middle of a curve with no shoulder to pull onto. The diesel motor just stopped, no warning, no coughing or struggling, just instant silence while the truck's momentum carried him forward. Rayford managed to steer onto a narrow strip of gravel beside the road, the truck rolling to a stop at an angle that blocked most of one lane. He sat there in sudden stillness, hands still gripping the wheel, and accepted the reality that Eldon had been telling the truth. His tanks were empty, his produce was going to start warming up within an hour, and he was going to have to go back to that station and find out what documents the mechanic wanted him to read. Rayford sat in his dead truck for 20 minutes, trying every trick he'd learned in 17 years of driving to coax even a drop of fuel through lines that he now knew were completely dry. He turned the key repeatedly, hearing the starter motor crank the engine over without catching, the sound growing progressively weaker as the battery drained. He checked every gauge and readout on his dashboard, finding nothing but zeros and error messages that confirmed what he already knew. His phone showed exactly what Eldon had predicted. No signal, just the words "no service" mocking him from the screen's upper corner. He tried moving to different positions in the cab, holding the phone up near the windshield and then out the window, searching for even a single bar that might let him make a call. Nothing changed. The signal remained dead, and the Arizona desert stretched out in all directions, offering no solutions. The temperature inside the cab was climbing steadily, the sun having shifted position so it now beat directly through the windshield, turning the interior into a greenhouse. Rayford's shirt was already soaked with sweat, and he could feel his skin starting to burn where the sun touched it through the glass. Behind him, the reefer unit on his trailer sat silent, no longer maintaining the required temperature for his produce load. Every minute that passed was costing him money as lettuce and tomatoes slowly warmed towards a spoilage. His dispatcher would be expecting a call when he arrived in Flagstaff, and when that call didn't come, they'd start asking questions that Rayford had no good answers for. How do you explain running out of fuel when you'd reported full tanks at your last stop? How do you explain stopping at a closed gas station that wasn't on any official route? He climbed down from the cab, his boots hitting the gravel shoulder with a crunch that seemed too loud in the desert quiet. A few vehicles had passed while he'd been sitting there, but none had stopped despite his obvious distress. Highway drivers had learned to be cautious about stopping for stranded truckers. Too many stories of robberies and scams had made people wary of offering help. He walked around his truck, checking the fuel tanks one more time as if the physical inspection might reveal something his gauges had missed. The tanks were bone dry, he could tell from the way they sounded when he tapped them with his knuckle. The hollow ring of empty metal, instead of the dull thud of liquid-filled containers. The walk back to the station would be approximately 3 miles based on his odometer reading. 3 miles in 100-degree heat with no water and no shade. Rayford had a half-empty bottle of water in his cab, warm and tasting like plastic, but it was all he had. He grabbed it along with his phone, wallet, and a baseball cap that would provide minimal sun protection, and locked the truck behind him. The highway stretched ahead and behind him in straight lines that seemed to go on forever. Heat shimmer creating lakes of false water on the asphalt that disappeared as he approached. He started walking back the way he'd come, following the white line at the road's edge, while his mind churned through what Eldon had said about documents and records that explained what had happened at the station. August 14th, 2013. The date kept circling through Rayford's thoughts, and about a mile into his walk he finally remembered why it seemed significant. He'd been driving this same route back then, had stopped at a different station near this area for fuel, and had heard other truckers talking about some kind of accident or incident that had closed down a gas station somewhere in the vicinity. The details were vague in his memory, worn down by 6 years of other routes and other conversations, but he recalled the tone of those discussions, hushed and uncomfortable, like people talking about something they didn't fully understand but knew was serious. The exit appeared in the distance, that faded green sign marking the turnoff, and Rayford left the highway to follow the broken 2-lane road toward the station. His legs were already aching from walking on hard asphalt in boots designed for driving rather than hiking, and his water bottle was now completely empty, drained in small sips that had done almost nothing to combat his growing thirst. The station came into view, looking exactly as he'd left it. The same faded gray buildings and ancient fuel pumps, but now Eldon was nowhere visible. No movement around the garage bay, no sign of life anywhere on the property. Just empty buildings baking in the afternoon sun, and that same sense of abandonment that had struck Rayford during his first visit. He approached cautiously, his exhaustion making him less careful than he should have been, but not completely eliminating his survival instincts. The main building's door still stood slightly ajar, that same 2-inch gap showing darkness beyond, and Rayford pulled it open slowly, wincing at the squeal of rusty hinges. The interior was cooler than outside, but not by much, and it took his eyes several seconds to adjust from bright sunlight to the dim interior. The space was a typical gas station convenience store layout, or had been once, with empty shelving units along the walls and a counter with an old register sitting behind protective glass that was cracked in several places. Dust covered everything in a thick layer that showed no recent disturbance, and the air smelled stale and chemical, like cleaning products that had been sitting in closed containers for years. Rayford's footsteps left clear prints in the dust as he moved deeper into the space, and he could see that no one else had walked here recently. The floor behind the counter was unmarked, the dust there as pristine as everywhere else. If Eldon had been using this building, he'd been remarkably careful about not disturbing anything, which struck Rayford as odd given the mechanic's claim that he still maintained the property. A door at the back of the store area led to what appeared to be a small office, and Rayford pushed through to find a desk, a filing cabinet, and walls covered in paperwork that had been pinned up and left to yellow with age. The paperwork consisted of receipts, delivery logs, maintenance records, all the documentation required to operate a commercial fuel station. Everything was dated from 2013 or earlier, the most recent document being a delivery receipt for diesel fuel dated August 13, 2013, the day before Eldon claimed the station had closed. The signature on the receipt was illegible, just a scrawled initial that could have been an E or a B or any number of letters. The filing cabinet sat in the corner, a standard 4-drawer metal unit with a combination lock hanging from the top drawer's handle. Rayford tried the lock and found it secured, the combination dial showing no obvious wear that might indicate frequently used numbers. He pulled at the drawer anyway, testing the lock's strength, and was surprised when the entire mechanism popped open with minimal resistance, the lock having been placed for show rather than security. The drawer slid open smoothly, its contents organized with surprising precision, manila folders arranged alphabetically by category: employees, equipment, financial, incidents, suppliers. The incidents folder was thicker than the others, and Rayford pulled it out, carrying it to the desk where better light came through the office's single small window. Inside were newspaper clippings, police reports, and handwritten notes that detailed a timeline of events spanning several months in 2013. The earliest document was a newspaper article dated May 3, 2013, from a local paper Rayford had never heard of, with the headline, "Gas Station Clerk Reported Missing." The article described how Willa Mae Rogers, a 23-year-old woman who worked nights at an unnamed gas station on a rural highway, had failed to show up for 2 consecutive shifts and couldn't be reached by phone. Her car had been found in the station's parking lot, keys still in the ignition, but there was no sign of Willa Mae herself. Rayford felt his stomach tighten as he continued reading. The next several articles tracked the investigation, which had gone nowhere fast. No witnesses, no evidence of foul play, no leads whatsoever. Willa Mae Rogers had simply vanished from a closed gas station in the middle of a night shift, leaving behind all her personal belongings, including her phone and purse. The police had investigated the station's owner, a man whose name was redacted in the reports, but had found no connection between him and the disappearance. The case had gone cold within weeks, filed away as another unsolved missing person case in a state that had plenty of them. But the folder contained more documents that painted a darker picture. A handwritten note dated June 15, 2013, appeared to be from someone named Eldon Price, based on the signature at the bottom, though the handwriting was shaky and irregular, like it had been written under stress. The note described strange occurrences at the station following Willa Mae's disappearance: equipment turning on by itself, sounds of someone walking in empty rooms, and the persistent smell of perfume that Willa Mae had worn, a floral scent that appeared and vanished without any logical source. More articles followed, each one detailing subsequent disappearances that all shared common elements. A delivery driver named Marcus had vanished in June while making a fuel delivery, his truck found running with a full load but no sign of Marcus anywhere. A state highway inspector had disappeared in July during a routine safety check of the station, his vehicle discovered locked and empty in the parking lot. By August, local authorities had begun investigating the station itself as a potential crime scene, though they'd found nothing that explained the pattern of disappearances. No bodies, no evidence of violence, just people arriving at the station and never leaving. The final document in the folder was a police report dated August 14, 2013, the day Eldon had mentioned as the station's closing date. The report described how officers had arrived at the station in response to a 911 call reporting screams coming from the property. What they'd found was documented in clinical language that somehow made it more disturbing. Extensive evidence of a struggle in the main building, blood spatters that suggested at least 2 injured persons, and drag marks leading from the store area toward the garage bay. But no bodies had been recovered, and no suspects had been identified. The station had been sealed as a crime scene, and the owner had been ordered to cease operations immediately pending the outcome of the investigation. Rayford set the report down with hands that had started trembling, and that's when he noticed the photographs clipped to the back of the folder. They showed the station from various angles, all taken during the police investigation, and in several of them he could see a figure standing in the background. The person was too far from the camera to identify clearly, but the coveralls and the general build looked disturbingly familiar. In one photo, taken from the parking lot looking toward the garage bay, the figure appeared to be holding something, a long-handled tool or possibly a weapon, though the image quality was too poor to be certain. "You found the folder." Eldon's voice came from directly behind Rayford, and the trucker spun around so fast he knocked the desk chair into the filing cabinet with a bang. The mechanic stood in the office doorway, somehow having entered the building and crossed the store area without making a sound despite the dust that should have recorded his footsteps. He looked exactly as he had earlier, same coveralls and same expression of cold satisfaction, but now Rayford was seeing him through the lens of what he'd just read, and the man's presence felt actively threatening in a way it hadn't before. "What happened here?" Rayford asked, his voice coming out rougher than he'd intended. "What happened to all those people, to Willa Mae Rogers and the others? And why am I here? Why did you make sure I'd run out of fuel and have to come back?" He was backing away as he spoke, putting the desk between himself and Eldon, though he knew that if this came to a physical confrontation, the furniture wouldn't provide much protection. Eldon stepped into the office, his movements unhurried, and closed the door behind him with a soft click that somehow felt final. What happened is that the station's owner, a man who'd been running this place for 30 years without any problems, decided he wanted to expand his operation, wanted to add a mechanic shop, do repairs and maintenance in addition to selling fuel. Hired me to run the shop, hired Willa Mae to work nights in the store, hired a few other people for various positions. Everything was fine for about 3 months, business was good, customers were happy. And then I found something. The mechanic moved to the filing cabinet and pulled open the bottom drawer, removing a leather-bound journal that looked old and well-used. He set it on the desk between himself and Rayford, flipping it open to show pages covered in handwriting that was neat and precise, but whose content was immediately disturbing. Rayford could see dates and times, detailed descriptions of people who'd stopped at the station, notes about their vehicles and their routes and their behavior. The entries read like surveillance reports, tracking individuals with an obsessive attention to detail that went far beyond normal business records. "The owner was documenting everyone who came through," Eldon continued, his voice taking on a storytelling quality, like he'd rehearsed this explanation many times. Had been doing it for years, filling up journals with information about drivers and travelers, building profiles on their habits and schedules. I didn't understand why at first, thought maybe he was just eccentric or overly cautious about security. But then I started noticing patterns. People he'd written about would sometimes disappear, not from the station, but from their normal routes, from their lives. They'd just vanish, and there'd be a small note in his journal marking the date of disappearance. Rayford forced himself to look at the journal's pages, scanning the entries and finding exactly what Eldon had described. Names and dates, physical descriptions, and license plate numbers, followed in some cases by a simple notation: completed. The word appeared dozens of times throughout the journal, always in red ink that stood out against the black text of the regular entries. Next to each completed notation was a number, sequential and increasing, like someone keeping count of accomplishments or goals achieved. "I confronted him about it," Eldon said, and for the first time his voice carried something other than cold satisfaction, something that might have been genuine emotion. Demanded to know what the journal meant, what he'd been doing with all this information he'd collected. And he told me everything, like he was proud of it, like he'd been waiting for someone to ask so he could finally explain his work. He'd been killing them, picking off travelers who fit certain criteria, people who were alone and whose routes brought them through regularly enough that he could plan for their arrival. He'd built a room beneath the garage bay, a space where he could take his victims and keep them for days before disposing of the bodies in the desert. The office suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in while Rayford's mind tried to reject what he was hearing. If that's true, if he was a serial killer, why didn't you go to the police? Why didn't you report him instead of confronting him yourself?" Even as he asked the question, Rayford could see the answer forming in Eldon's expression, a complex mixture of guilt and resignation that told its own story. "Because I didn't confront him until after I'd found Willa May," Eldon said quietly. "She disappeared during her night shift, and I'd come to the station the next morning looking for her, thought maybe she'd gotten sick and gone to rest in the back room. Found the door to the basement instead, hidden behind a false wall in the garage bay. Went down there and found Willa May alive, but barely, chained to a wall in a room that was set up like something out of a horror movie. Torture implements, recording equipment, documentation of everything he'd done to previous victims. I got her out, got her upstairs, and she was begging me to call the police, begging me to help her." Eldon paused, his hands tightening on the journal until the leather cover creased. But the owner was there, had been watching from somewhere, had security cameras I hadn't known about. He came out of the storage building with a shotgun, told me I had two choices: help him clean up the situation or become part of the situation myself. Said he had evidence planted that would make it look like I was responsible for everything. Documentation that showed I'd been the one keeping the journal and selecting victims. He was thorough, had thought of every angle, and I believed him when he said I'd spend my life in prison if I didn't cooperate. Rayford felt sick, his stomach churning with a combination of heat exhaustion, thirst, and the growing horror of understanding where this story was going. "What did you do?" he asked, though he already knew the answer, could see it in Eldon's eyes and in the way the mechanic's shoulders had slumped with the weight of confession. "I helped him," Eldon said simply. "Helped him kill Willa May because she'd seen too much and would have identified both of us. Helped him clean up the basement room and remove any evidence that she'd been there. Helped him create the story that she'd simply vanished during her shift with no explanation. And then I kept helping him for the next 3 months, kept running the garage bay and keeping quiet about what I knew, because the alternative was prison or death, and I was too much of a coward to choose either." The mechanic moved around the desk, and Rayford backed away until he hit the wall, trapped in the small office with a man who'd just confessed to murder. But Eldon made no threatening moves, just stood there with his hands hanging loose at his sides, and his expression empty of everything except exhaustion. "The others disappeared the same way," he continued. "The delivery driver, the inspector, a few travelers who stopped for fuel at the wrong time. The owner selected them. I helped dispose of the evidence afterward. It was a system that worked until it didn't, until one of his victims managed to get a 911 call out before he could stop them. Police showed up, found the evidence of struggle, and everything fell apart." "Where is he now?" Rayford asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The owner. Where did he go after the police investigation?" He could feel his phone in his pocket, still showing no signal, still useless as a tool for calling for help. The office door was blocked by Eldon's position, and the small window was too high and too small to provide an escape route. He was trapped in a room with a confessed murderer, in a station that had been the site of multiple killings, and no one knew where he was or that he needed help. Eldon's laugh was bitter and short. "That's the thing. He didn't go anywhere. He's still here, has been this whole time. The police investigation concluded with no arrests because they never found bodies and couldn't prove crimes without physical evidence. The station got closed down, the property got tied up in legal disputes, and the owner just stayed here, living in that storage building and maintaining his operation in secret. I couldn't leave because he had too much on me, had documentation and evidence that would send me to prison if I ever tried to walk away. So I stayed too, became his assistant permanently, helping him wait for the occasional traveler who still finds this place despite the rerouted highway." Rayford's hands balled into fists, anger cutting through his fear. "And I'm supposed to be what? The next victim? You sabotaged my fuel gauge to make sure I'd come back here, make sure I'd be helpless and isolated so you and your boss could do whatever you've been doing to people for the past 6 years?" His eyes were scanning the office, looking for anything that could serve as a weapon, finding nothing but paperwork and office supplies that wouldn't be effective against someone Eldon's size. "No," Eldon said, and his expression shifted to something that might have been genuine regret. "You're not a victim. You're a witness. I brought you back here and showed you the documents because I can't do this anymore, can't keep helping him, can't keep living with what I've done. I need someone to know the truth, someone to take this information to authorities who might actually do something with it. The journal, the folder, all of it is yours to take. Drive back to Flagstaff, go to the police, show them everything, tell them where to find this place and what's been happening here. Maybe that makes me complicit in whatever comes next. Maybe I end up in prison anyway, but at least it stops. At least no one else disappears." Rayford wanted to believe him, wanted to think that this confession was genuine, and that Eldon was actually trying to do the right thing despite his previous actions. But something about the mechanic's story didn't align with the reality of Rayford's situation. "If you wanted me to take evidence to the police, why drain my fuel tanks? Why strand me here instead of just showing me the documents and letting me leave with them? None of this makes sense if your goal is actually to stop the killings." The mechanic's expression changed, the regret melting away to reveal something harder underneath. "Because the owner needs to believe you're just another victim, just another traveler who got stranded and came back looking for help. He's watching right now, has cameras throughout the property that feed to monitors in the storage building. If he thought I was helping you escape, if he saw me just handing over evidence and sending you on your way, he'd kill us both before you made it to the highway. This has to look like you stumbled onto the information by accident, like you found the documents while waiting for me to help with your fuel problem. That gives us both plausibility, gives you time to get away before he realizes what you know." Rayford glanced around the office, looking for cameras, finding several small lenses mounted in corners and behind fixtures, all pointing toward the desk and the filing cabinet. If Eldon was telling the truth, then everything they'd said and done in this room had been recorded, which meant the owner already knew about the documents being shared. Unless Eldon had somehow disabled the cameras or was lying about their existence entirely, which seemed increasingly likely given all the other deceptions that had been layered into this situation. "I need fuel for my truck," Rayford said, making a decision to play along while he figured out what was really happening. "If I'm going to get to Flagstaff and talk to police, I need fuel and I need it now before my produce load spoils completely. Can you help with that? Or was that a lie too?" He kept his voice steady, trying to project confidence he didn't feel, trying to maintain control of a situation that had spiraled far beyond his understanding. Eldon nodded and moved toward the office door, pulling it open and gesturing for Rayford to follow. "Fuel's in the underground tank. Still has about 500 gallons left from before the station closed. Pump system still works if you prime it manually. Come on, I'll show you how it's done, and then you can fill up and get out of here. Take the journal and the folder with you. Hide them somewhere in your truck where they won't be obvious if someone looks inside. And when you get to Flagstaff, when you talk to police, tell them to come fast and come prepared. The owner won't surrender peacefully, and he's got weapons stored throughout the property." They walked through the abandoned store area, Rayford clutching the journal and folder against his chest while his eyes tracked every shadow and movement. The main building felt like a trap waiting to spring, every corner hiding potential threats, every sound making him flinch. Eldon moved with confidence, leading him toward the rear exit, but Rayford couldn't shake the feeling that this was all choreographed, all designed to put him in a specific position at a specific time for reasons that had nothing to do with justice or stopping murders. The door to the garage bay stood open, And through it, Rayford could see his truck sitting beside the ancient fuel pumps exactly where he'd left it hours earlier. Except that was impossible, because he'd left his truck stranded on the highway miles away, had walked all the way back to the station through 100-degree heat. But there it was, unmistakable, with his company logo on the doors and his specific unit number on the cab. He stopped walking, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were showing him. "How is my truck here?" he asked, his voice coming out strangled. "I left it on the highway. I walked back here. This doesn't make sense." He turned to look at Eldon, searching the mechanic's face for any sign that this was a trick or a hallucination brought on by heat and dehydration. Eldon's expression was unreadable, carefully neutral in a way that felt practiced. "Your truck never left the station, Rayford. You never made it back to the highway. You've been here the entire time, reading documents in the office while I worked on getting the fuel pump operational. The walk you remember, the highway breakdown, all of that happened in your head while you were sitting in that office chair. Heat exhaustion does that sometimes, creates false memories that feel completely real. You've been here for maybe 40 minutes total, not the hours you think have passed." Rayford looked down at his clothes, finding them soaked with sweat and covered in dust from walking. His boots showed wear patterns consistent with miles of walking on asphalt. His water bottle was empty, drained during a journey that Eldon was now claiming had never happened. The evidence of his experience was physical, tangible, impossible to dismiss as hallucination or heat exhaustion, unless everything was a lie, unless even his perceptions of his own body couldn't be trusted anymore. "I don't believe you," Rayford said, but his voice carried uncertainty now, doubt creeping in around the edges of his conviction. "I walked 3 miles back here. I remember every step. You're lying, or I'm losing my mind, but one way or another something is very wrong with this entire situation." He moved toward his truck, still clutching the documents, desperate to reach something familiar and solid that might anchor him to reality. The truck's door was unlocked, which was wrong because Rayford always locked his cab when leaving it unattended. He pulled the door open and climbed up, finding the interior exactly as he'd left it. Keys in the ignition, coffee cup in the holder, his logbook on the passenger seat. But when he turned the key, the engine started immediately. Diesel motor rumbling to life like it had never stopped running. The fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, contradicting everything he'd experienced or thought he'd experienced over the past hours. The trip computer displayed normal operational data, no error messages or blank screens. Eldon appeared at the driver's side door, that same unreadable expression on his weathered face. "Fill up your tanks before you leave," he said, gesturing toward the fuel pumps. "Top off everything. Make sure you have enough to reach Flagstaff and beyond if needed. The pump system is active now, works just like any normal station. And remember what I said about showing those documents to police. They need to know what happened here, need to know what's still happening. You might be confused right now about what's real and what isn't, but those documents are real. The crimes they describe are real. That's what matters." Rayford nodded mechanically, his mind still trying to reconcile contradictory information that couldn't all be true simultaneously. He maneuvered his truck to the fuel pumps and began the process of filling his tanks, watching the ancient mechanical numbers flip over as diesel flowed into his rig. The fuel was clean, no signs of contamination from sitting in underground tanks for 6 years, and his truck's systems showed normal readings throughout the filling process. When the pump clicked off, indicating full tanks, Rayford replaced the nozzle and climbed back into his cab without looking back at Eldon or the station. He drove away slowly, following the broken road back toward the highway, checking his mirrors every few seconds to watch the station recede into the distance. Eldon stood in the same spot the entire time, arms crossed over his chest, growing smaller but never quite disappearing even after Rayford had driven far enough that the mechanic should have been invisible. The highway appeared ahead, and Rayford took the on-ramp with a sense of relief so profound it almost felt like joy. His truck was running perfectly, his fuel tanks were full, and he had documentation of crimes that could potentially shut down whatever was happening at that station. The relief lasted exactly 4 miles before he noticed the pickup truck following him. Dark blue or maybe black, hard to tell in the fading evening light, maintaining a consistent distance behind his rig. The truck had appeared seemingly from nowhere. No exit ramps or side roads in the stretch where it had materialized, and now it matched his speed exactly, accelerating when he accelerated and slowing when he slowed. Rayford tried changing lanes to see if the truck would pass, but it changed lanes too, staying positioned directly behind him like it was tethered to his bumper by an invisible cord. His CB radio crackled to life suddenly, and a voice came through that sounded like Eldon, but wasn't quite right, the tone slightly off, the pacing just irregular enough to be unsettling. "Rayford, you've got about 15 minutes before your engine fails again. Real failure this time. Not a fuel problem, but something mechanical that can't be fixed on the roadside. When that happens, when you're sitting there watching smoke pour from under your hood, that truck behind you is going to pull alongside. The driver is going to offer to help, going to seem friendly and concerned. And you're going to have to decide whether to accept that help or take your chances waiting for someone else to stop. Choose wisely. Only one of those options lets you live long enough to show those documents to anyone." The transmission ended, and Rayford's radio went dead again. No static, just silence. He keyed his mic to respond, found the system completely non-functional, and slammed his palm against the dashboard in frustration that was rapidly transforming into genuine terror. The document sat on his passenger seat, the journal and folder containing evidence of multiple murders, and he was being followed by someone who presumably didn't want that evidence reaching authorities. The pickup truck behind him moved closer, pulling to within maybe 20 feet of his rear bumper, close enough that he could see 2 figures in the cab instead of 1. His engine temperature gauge started climbing, needle moving from normal operating range toward red warning zone with alarming speed. Rayford watched it with the sick certainty that Eldon's prediction was about to come true, that his truck was going to fail again, and this time he wouldn't have the option of walking back to a station for help. The pickup truck accelerated slightly, pulling alongside his trailer, and through his mirror, Rayford could see the passenger window rolling down. A hand emerged holding something, and for a terrible moment Rayford thought it might be a weapon, but it was just a piece of paper pressed against the glass. He couldn't read it from his position, couldn't make out what message they were trying to convey. The temperature gauge hit red, and Rayford's engine began making sounds that his 17 years of experience told him meant catastrophic failure was imminent. Metal grinding against metal, pressure releasing in places it shouldn't, and the distinct smell of burning oil seeping into the cab. He started looking for a safe place to pull over, some stretch of shoulder that would get him out of traffic lanes, and that's when he saw it ahead on the road. Another gas station, this one looking operational with lights on and vehicles parked in the lot. The station's sign read Dust Station Number 47 in letters that glowed with recently installed neon, and Rayford had never been more grateful to see commercial lighting in his life. He coaxed his dying truck off the highway and into the station's parking lot, hearing his engine make one final grinding sound before ceasing completely. The truck rolled to a stop near the fuel pumps, and Rayford sat there watching his temperature gauge bury itself beyond red while the pickup truck that had been following him drove past the exit without slowing. Rayford sat in his dead truck for several minutes, watching steam pour from under the hood while his mind tried to process the impossible timing of finding another gas station exactly when his engine had failed. The coincidence felt too perfect, too convenient, like the universe was following a script he hadn't been given access to. Through his windshield, he could see the station's interior through large plate glass windows. Bright fluorescent lighting illuminating aisles of merchandise and a counter where a clerk was visible, talking on the phone with animated gestures. The station looked new, almost aggressively modern, with digital fuel pumps and LED price signs that cycled through different products and services. Everything about it screamed legitimate business, which somehow made Rayford more suspicious rather than less. He grabbed the journal and folder from his passenger seat, tucking them under his shirt where they'd be concealed but accessible, and climbed down from his cab. The evening air was starting to cool, finally, temperature dropping from unbearable to merely uncomfortable, and the station's parking lot showed evidence of regular use. Fresh tire marks, trash receptacles that had been recently emptied, and pavement that looked like it had been sealed within the past year. A family in a minivan was fueling up at one of the pumps, the parents looking tired but normal, their kids visible through the vehicle's windows watching something on a tablet. The scene was so ordinary, so perfectly mundane, that Rayford felt some of his tension ease slightly. The station's door opened with an electronic chime, and cold air conditioning hit him like a wall, almost painful after the desert heat. The interior was exactly what it appeared to be from outside, a modern convenience store with the usual array of snacks, drinks, and automotive supplies. Country music played from overhead speakers, not too loud but present enough to create ambient sound that felt welcoming. The clerk behind the counter looked up at his entrance, a woman, maybe in her 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and a name tag that read Luetta in white letters on blue plastic. She smiled automatically, the practiced expression of someone who'd greeted thousands of customers, and returned to her phone conversation. Rayford moved deeper into the store, pretending to browse while actually scanning for anything that might indicate this place was connected to the station where he'd been trapped. The merchandise was all current, products with dates that showed they'd been manufactured recently, and the prices matched what he'd expect from a typical highway gas station. He pulled out his phone and found, to his immense relief, that he had a signal now. 3 bars and 4G data, more than enough to make calls or access the internet. He immediately pulled up his dispatcher's number and called, needing to hear a familiar voice and report his mechanical failure. The call went through, and his dispatcher, a woman named Garrett, who'd been with the company for 15 years, answered on the second ring. "Rayford, where the hell are you? Your GPS tracker shows you should have been in Flagstaff 2 hours ago, but you're pinging about 50 miles south of there. What's going on?" Her voice carried concern mixed with irritation, the typical tone of someone whose job involved managing drivers who frequently encountered unexpected problems. Rayford moved toward the back of the store, lowering his voice even though the only other person inside was the clerk who seemed absorbed in her phone call. "I had fuel gauge problems that turned into engine problems. I'm at a station called Dust Station number 47, somewhere off the main highway. I need a tow truck and probably a new engine. This one's completely seized. And Garrett, I need you to contact the Arizona State Police for me. Tell them I have evidence related to multiple murders that occurred at a different gas station in this area. I know that sounds crazy, but I'm serious. People have died, and I have documentation that proves it." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that Rayford thought the call had dropped, but then Garrett's voice came back, slower and more careful than before. "Rayford, are you feeling okay? Heat exhaustion can cause confusion, make people say things that don't make sense. Maybe you should go inside that station and sit down, drink some water, cool off before we talk about what you think you found. I'll get a tow truck to your location, but I'm also going to have them bring a medic to check you out, make sure you're not having some kind of medical episode." The condescension in her tone made Rayford's jaw clench with frustration. "I'm not confused, and I don't need a medic. I need police, and I need them now before whatever happened at the other station happens again. Just make the call, please. Tell them to ask about a place that closed in August 2013. Tell them there are missing person cases connected to it. They'll know what I'm talking about." He ended the call before she could argue further, hoping that she'd follow through despite thinking he'd lost his mind from heat exposure. The clerk had finished her phone conversation and was now watching Rayford with an expression that had shifted from welcoming to wary. He realized how he must look. Clothes soaked with sweat, covered in dust and grime, clutching his phone like a lifeline and talking urgently about murders. He approached the counter with his hands visible and his posture deliberately non-threatening, trying to project normalcy despite everything that had happened. "Sorry about that," he said, gesturing vaguely toward where he'd been standing. "Having a rough day. My truck's engine just died in your parking lot, and I've been dealing with some strange situations on the road. I'm waiting for a tow truck, but I'd like to buy some water and maybe use your restroom if that's okay." The clerk's expression softened slightly, though she kept one hand near what Rayford assumed was an emergency button or phone under the counter. "Water's in the cooler, third aisle. Restrooms in the back, door on the left past the beer cave. You need me to call anyone for you, police or medical or anything?" Her voice was professional, but kind. The tone of someone who'd dealt with distressed travelers before and knew how to handle them without escalating the situation. Rayford shook his head and moved to the cooler, grabbing 2 large bottles of water and carrying them back to the counter. As he paid, he noticed a bulletin board behind the clerk covered in community notices, local business cards, and several missing person flyers. One of the flyers caught his attention, a young woman's photo above text describing her disappearance from a gas station in August 2013. The photo showed Willa Mae Rogers, the same woman whose case file Rayford had read about in Eldon's documents, and seeing her face here in this modern station felt like reality was fracturing around him. "That's a sad case," the clerk said, noticing where Rayford's attention had gone. "Girl disappeared from a station about 20 miles from here, never found any trace of her. My sister went to high school with her, said she was planning to go to nursing school before she vanished. Happened the same day the station closed down, which made everyone think the owner was involved. But they never could prove anything. He died about 2 years ago, heart attack or stroke or something, and took whatever secrets he had to the grave." Rayford's hands tightened on the water bottles, condensation making them slippery. "The owner died? You're sure about that?" If the owner was dead, then Eldon's story about being trapped at the station and forced to help with ongoing crimes couldn't be current. Either Eldon had been lying about the timeline, or something else was happening that Rayford didn't understand yet. What about the mechanic who worked there, a guy named Eldon Price? What happened to him after the station closed? The clerk's expression shifted to something Rayford couldn't quite read, a mixture of confusion and concern. There wasn't any mechanic working at that station when it closed. The owner ran it by himself for the last few years it was open, couldn't afford to pay employees after business dropped off. Where did you hear about someone named Eldon Price? Her hand had moved closer to whatever emergency system she had under the counter, and Rayford realized his questions were making him seem more unstable rather than less. He backed away from the counter, mind racing through implications that made no sense. If there had been no mechanic at the station, then who had he talked to? Who had shown him the documents and told him about the murders? The journal and folder were still tucked under his shirt, physical evidence that his experiences had been real. But now even that certainty was crumbling. "I need to use your restroom," he said, his voice coming out strangled. "I'll be right back." He moved toward the rear of the store before the clerk could respond, desperate for a moment of privacy to think. The restroom was small but clean, with harsh fluorescent lighting that made Rayford's reflection in the mirror look ghastly. His face was sunburned and covered in dust, his eyes bloodshot from dehydration and stress, and he looked like someone who'd been through far more than just a mechanical breakdown. He set the water bottles on the sink and pulled the journal and folder from under his shirt, spreading them out on the counter beside the faucet. The documents were real, solid, and tangible, pages yellowed with age and text that was clearly printed or written years ago. This wasn't a heat-induced hallucination. These materials existed and contained detailed information about crimes that had actually occurred. He opened the journal to a random page and found himself reading an entry dated July 23, 2013. Subject arrived at station at approximately 3:30 p.m., male, late 40s, driving a red Chevrolet pickup with Oklahoma plates. Subject exhibited nervous behavior, repeatedly checking his phone and looking around parking lot. Engaged in conversation about route to Flagstaff, provided detailed information about his schedule and destination. Marked for follow-up observation. Update July 24th. Subject returned at 11:45 p.m., stated he was having fuel pump problems. Isolated location, no other vehicles present. Conditions optimal. Completed at 12:30 a.m. The clinical language describing what was clearly a murder made Rayford's stomach turn, and he flipped through more pages finding dozens of similar entries. The owner of that first station had documented his victims with the care of someone conducting scientific research, treating human lives as data points in some kind of experiment. Rayford photographed several pages with his phone, creating a digital backup in case the physical documents were lost or destroyed, and was about to continue when he heard raised voices from the main store area. He cracked the restroom door open and could see through the gap that the clerk was talking with someone, a man whose voice sounded familiar in a way that made Rayford's pulse quicken. He couldn't see the person from his angle, but he could hear the conversation clearly enough. The man was asking about a truck driver who'd come in recently, described someone matching Rayford's appearance, and claimed to be looking for him because of a dispute over payment for mechanical work. The clerk was responding cautiously, saying she couldn't give out information about customers, and the man's voice was getting more insistent. Rayford quietly locked the restroom door and pulled out his phone, pulling up the photos he'd just taken and texting them to his own email address to ensure they were backed up somewhere beyond his phone's storage. As he worked, he could hear footsteps approaching the restroom, multiple sets moving with purpose through the store. His text went through just as someone tried the restroom door handle, finding it locked, followed by knocking that was too hard to be friendly. "Rayford, we know you're in there. We need to talk about those documents you took. They don't belong to you, and they're not telling the story you think they're telling. Open the door, and let's discuss this reasonably." The voice belonged to Eldon, but it sounded wrong somehow, the tone too smooth, and the pacing too perfect, like someone reading from a script. Rayford looked around the restroom for exits and found only a small window above the toilet, maybe 2 feet square, probably too small for him to fit through even if he could reach it. He was trapped in a locked room with people outside who wanted the documents badly enough to follow him to a second location, which suggested they were willing to do whatever was necessary to retrieve them. His phone showed that he still had signal, and he quickly dialed 911, speaking quietly but urgently when the operator answered. "This is an emergency. I'm trapped in the restroom at Dust Station number 47 off Highway 89, and there are people trying to break in. I have evidence of multiple murders, and I believe the same people responsible for those crimes are here now. I need police immediately." He gave the operator his name and trucking company information, trying to provide details that would help them locate him, while the pounding on the door increased in intensity. The operator assured him that units were being dispatched and told him to stay on the line, but the door was already beginning to splinter around the lock. Cheap, hollow-core construction giving way under sustained force. The door burst open and 3 people entered the small restroom. Eldon, a woman who might have been the clerk from the counter, and a man Rayford didn't recognize wearing maintenance worker coveralls. They moved with coordinated precision, blocking any escape route while maintaining careful distance from Rayford himself. Eldon held out one hand in a placating gesture, his expression reasonable and calm. "We're not going to hurt you, Rayford. We just need those documents back, and we need you to understand what you've actually stumbled into. The journal and folder you took, they're part of a law enforcement operation that's been running for 6 years. We're federal agents, and you've compromised an active investigation by removing evidence from a secured location." Rayford kept his phone pressed to his ear, making sure the 911 operator could hear everything being said. "Show me your badges, then. Show me federal identification. Prove you're who you claim to be." He knew they wouldn't be able to produce legitimate credentials because everything about this situation screamed deception, but he wanted their refusal on record for when police arrived. His hand tightened on the journal, prepared to fight if they tried to take it by force. Eldon's expression shifted, the reasonable mask slipping to show something harder underneath. "We don't carry traditional identification when working undercover. You should understand that. The station where you found those documents has been used as a trap location for the past 6 years, trying to draw out associates of the original owner who might still be operating in the area. You walking in and taking evidence has potentially destroyed years of careful work and put multiple agents at risk. So please, just hand over the documents and we can all walk away from this without further complications." The story was plausible enough that Rayford found himself wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake, if he'd misread the entire situation and was actually interfering with a legitimate investigation. But then he remembered details that didn't fit Eldon's narrative. The way his truck had been moved without explanation. The false memory of walking back from the highway. The clerk claiming there had never been a mechanic at the original station. These were not the actions of federal agents conducting an investigation. These were the actions of people desperately trying to control information and eliminate witnesses. "If you're federal agents," Rayford said slowly, thinking through each word carefully, "then you won't have any problem with me keeping these documents until the police arrive. I called 911 before you came in, and they're sending units now. You can explain your investigation to them, show them whatever credentials you have, and they can verify your story independently. If everything's legitimate, I'll apologize for the misunderstanding and hand over the documents. But until then, I'm keeping them and I'm staying right here." The 3 people in front of him exchanged glances, some kind of silent communication passing between them, and then the woman moved forward quickly, faster than Rayford expected. She grabbed for the journal with one hand while her other hand pulled something from her pocket, a syringe or small knife, the motion so practiced it seemed almost casual. Rayford jerked backward, hitting the wall with enough force to rattle the mirror, and swung the heavy water bottle at her head. The plastic connected with a hollow thud, and she staggered back, dropping whatever she'd been holding as her hands went to her face. The commotion seemed to break whatever restraint the other 2 had been showing, and they rushed forward simultaneously. Rayford threw the journal at the maintenance worker, seeing papers scatter across the bathroom floor, and tried to push past Eldon toward the door. The mechanic caught him by the arm with surprising strength, fingers digging in hard enough to leave bruises, and slammed him against the sink with enough force to drive the air from Rayford's lungs. His phone flew from his hand, skittering across the tile floor toward the toilet where it splashed into the water with a terminal-sounding plop. "You should have just cooperated," Eldon said, his voice carrying genuine regret. "This didn't have to be difficult. The journal you're so desperate to protect, it doesn't tell the story you think it tells. Those entries about victims, about completed subjects, they're not describing murders. They're describing something much stranger. Something you wouldn't believe even if I explained it." The original station owner discovered something, a pattern in how certain people traveled through the desert, how they seemed to be pulled toward specific locations at specific times. He documented it for years, trying to understand what was drawing them, and eventually he figured out that the station itself was the attractor. Something about its location, or maybe something he'd built there, was creating a kind of gravity well for certain individuals. The maintenance worker had gathered up the scattered journal pages and was carefully replacing them in order, his movements meticulous despite the chaos. The woman had recovered from the water bottle strike and was blocking the bathroom door, one hand still pressed to her face where Rayford had hit her. They had him completely trapped, and he knew that whatever happened next would determine whether he ever left this station alive. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice coming out hoarse from the impact against the sink. "What happens now?" Eldon released his grip on Rayford's arm, but didn't step back, maintaining close proximity that prevented any escape attempts. "What happens now is that you make a choice. You can accept that you've stumbled into something you don't understand and agree to forget everything you've seen today. We'll fix your truck free of charge, send you on your way to Flagstaff, and this entire incident becomes just another strange day on the road that you'll eventually convince yourself was a heat-induced dream. Or you can insist on keeping those documents and telling authorities about what you think happened, in which case we'll have to demonstrate what the journal entries actually mean, show you firsthand what completed means in this context. I can promise you won't enjoy that demonstration, and once you've experienced it, you won't be able to go back to your normal life even if you wanted to." The threat was clear enough, but Rayford still didn't understand what exactly they were threatening him with. "Demonstrate how? What are you people actually doing? What is this place?" He was stalling, hoping that police were actually responding to his 911 call, hoping that someone would arrive before the situation escalated beyond the point of recovery. Through the bathroom's small window he could see darkness outside, evening having transitioned to full night while he'd been trapped, and he wondered how much time had passed since he'd entered the station. The woman at the door spoke for the first time, her voice nasally from the blow to her face. "This station is Station 47, part of a network that covers the entire Southwest. There are 63 stations total, all built on specific geographic points that create patterns we're still trying to understand fully. People are drawn to these locations, pulled by something in their psychology or their history, or maybe just random chance. When they arrive, we document them, study them, and occasionally some of them become part of the network themselves. Voluntary joining, mostly, though we can facilitate the process if someone is particularly resistant. You've been documented now, Rayford Keene. Your visit was recorded, your information was logged, and you're part of our pattern, whether you accept it or not." The maintenance worker had finished collecting the journal pages and now held the reconstructed volume in his hands, offering it back to Rayford with an expression that might have been sympathy. "Take it," he said quietly. "Take the journal and the folder. Drive to Flagstaff. Show everything to police just like you planned. They'll investigate, they'll find the original station, and they'll discover that it was demolished 18 months ago. Nothing left but a concrete pad and some rusted fuel pumps. The owner died in that heart attack the clerk mentioned, and there are no ongoing operations, no federal investigation, nothing but desert and memories. The documents you're holding are real. The crimes they describe happened, but you'll never be able to prove any connection to us or to this station. We don't exist in any official capacity, and by tomorrow morning you'll start questioning whether we ever existed at all." Rayford took the journal with trembling hands, his mind refusing to accept what he was hearing even as part of him recognized the truth in it. These people had been operating for years, documenting travelers and studying patterns, and they'd built a system sophisticated enough to exist completely outside official channels. Whether their explanation about geographic points and attraction was real, or just another layer of deception didn't matter. What mattered was that they had power and resources, and no apparent concern about authorities discovering them. "The police are coming," he said, though it sounded weak even to his own ears. "I called 911. They'll be here any minute." Eldon nodded, completely unconcerned by this information. "They'll come. They'll find you in the parking lot with your broken-down truck, and you'll tell them whatever story you want. But when they run checks on this station, they'll find that Dust Station No. 47 is a legitimate business operated by a woman named Louetta Voss, who's owned it for 8 years without any complaints or incidents. They'll see a modern facility with normal operations and no connection to any crimes or disappearances. And when you show them your documents, they'll see exactly what we want them to see. Evidence of crimes that were committed by a man who's been dead for 2 years, at a location that no longer exists, with no current threat to anyone. Case closed, mystery solved, and you can continue driving your routes knowing that you did your civic duty." The three of them moved aside finally, creating a path to the door, and Rayford walked through on legs that felt unsteady. The main store area looked exactly as it had when he'd entered. Bright lights, normal merchandise, country music playing softly. Through the windows he could see his truck still sitting in the parking lot with steam no longer rising from under the hood, and beyond that the highway with its steady stream of evening traffic. Everything appeared normal, mundane, completely at odds with the conversation that had just occurred in the bathroom. He moved toward the exit, still clutching the journal and folder, and pushed through the door into night air that felt almost cold after the air-conditioned interior. Police lights appeared in the distance, red and blue strobing through the darkness, and Rayford felt a surge of relief that was immediately tempered by uncertainty. What would he tell them? That he'd been threatened by gas station employees who claimed to be part of a network of 63 stations studying travel patterns. That he had evidence of murders from 6 years ago that might or might not be connected to current operations. The story sounded insane even in his own head, and he knew how it would sound to officers responding to what they probably thought was just another highway distress call. He looked back at the station and saw through the windows that Eldon and the others had vanished, leaving only the clerk visible behind the counter, talking on the phone again as if nothing unusual had happened. The police car pulled into the parking lot and a single officer emerged, a woman in her 40s with the tired expression of someone working a long shift. She approached Rayford with one hand resting casually near her service weapon, her posture alert but not aggressive. "You made the 911 call about being threatened?" she asked, her eyes scanning him quickly, noting his disheveled appearance and the documents clutched against his chest. "Dispatcher said something about murders and people trying to break into a bathroom. Want to tell me what's going on here?" Rayford opened his mouth to explain, to tell her everything that had happened from the moment he'd stopped at that first abandoned station, but the words wouldn't come out the way he'd planned. Instead, he found himself giving an edited version, mentioning mechanical troubles and finding documents about old crimes, leaving out the parts about Eldon and the confrontation and the claims about networks and patterns. Even as he spoke, he could hear how weak the story sounded, how it failed to justify an emergency 911 call. The officer listened patiently, occasionally asking clarifying questions, and when he finished she asked to see the documents he kept mentioning. Rayford handed over the journal and folder, watching as she flipped through pages with an expression that grew more skeptical with each entry she read. "These documents," she said slowly, "they describe crimes from 2013. Why are you just now reporting them, and where did you say you found them?" Her tone suggested she was already forming conclusions about his mental state, already deciding that this was a case of heat exhaustion or substance abuse rather than a legitimate report of criminal activity. "I found them today," Rayford said, hearing the desperation creeping into his voice. at a closed gas station about 20 miles from here, place that's been abandoned since 2013. I was having fuel gauge problems, stopped there looking for help, and the mechanic showed me these documents. Then my truck broke down again, and I ended up here, and the people from the first station followed me. Even to his own ears, it sounded confused and inconsistent, and he could see the officer's expression shifting from skeptical to concerned, the look of someone deciding whether this situation required medical intervention rather than law enforcement. The officer walked back to her patrol car with the documents, and Rayford could see her talking on her radio, probably running checks on the station and the names mentioned in the journal. She spent about 10 minutes in the car, and when she returned, her expression had settled into something more definitive. "Mr. Keene, I've confirmed that there was a gas station in this area that closed in 2013 after several missing person cases were investigated. The owner died 2 years ago without charges being filed due to lack of evidence. The station has since been demolished, and there's no ongoing investigation. These documents you have might be legitimate historical records, and if so, they should be turned over to the detective who handled the original cases. But there's no current threat, no active crimes being committed, and no one here at this station has filed any complaint against you or reported any threatening behavior." She handed the documents back to Rayford with an expression that was trying for sympathetic but landing closer to patronizing. "I think you've had a rough day with mechanical problems and heat exposure, and maybe you've let your imagination run away with you a little bit. That happens out here sometimes. The desert can play tricks on people's perceptions. Why don't you let me call a tow truck for you, get your rig taken care of, and you can decide what to do with those documents once you've had some rest and food. I can also have a medic come check you out. Make sure you're not dehydrated or suffering from heat exhaustion." Rayford wanted to argue, wanted to insist that something more was happening than just heat-induced confusion, but he could see that the officer had already made up her mind about the situation. She'd categorized him as a distressed driver having some kind of episode, and nothing he said would change that assessment. He accepted her offer to call a tow truck, and within an hour his Peterbilt was being loaded onto a flatbed for transport to a repair facility in Flagstaff. The officer stayed with him until the tow truck arrived, making friendly conversation about routes and weather, treating him like someone who needed to be handled gently, rather than someone reporting serious crimes. By the time Rayford finally reached Flagstaff in a cab arranged by the towing company, it was nearly midnight. He checked into a cheap motel near the repair shop, too exhausted to do anything but fall onto the bed fully clothed with the journal and folder still clutched against his chest. Sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by dreams of Eldon's face and the woman with the syringe and endless hallways that all led back to the same abandoned gas station. He woke repeatedly to check that the documents were still there, still real, still proof that he hadn't imagined the entire experience. The next morning brought a call from the repair shop with news that made Rayford's remaining certainty crumble. His truck's engine showed no signs of catastrophic failure, no seized components or burned parts. Whatever mechanical problem had caused the breakdown had apparently resolved itself, or, more accurately, had never existed in the first place. The mechanic suggested that maybe he'd gotten some contaminated fuel that had temporarily clogged his system, but after running diagnostic tests, everything appeared normal and functional. They could do a complete engine rebuild if he wanted, but it would cost thousands of dollars to fix problems that weren't actually present. Rayford picked up his truck in a daze, paid for the diagnostic work and the tow, and sat in his cab trying to decide what to do next. The journal sat on his passenger seat, its pages filled with descriptions of crimes that had definitely occurred but couldn't be prosecuted because the perpetrator was dead. The folder contained police reports and newspaper articles that confirmed the basic facts of Eldon's story, but couldn't prove any ongoing conspiracy or network of stations. He could take everything to the detective who'd handled the original investigation, could try to make someone believe that there was more happening than just historical crimes, but he knew how that conversation would go. He'd be dismissed as another conspiracy theorist, another trucker who'd spent too much time alone on empty highways developing paranoid delusions. He started his truck and pulled out of the repair shop, heading toward the address for his delivery that was now a full day late. His dispatcher had been surprisingly understanding when he'd called to explain the delay, had even arranged for the produce load to be diverted to a different truck since it was already spoiled from the reefer unit being offline. All Rayford had to do now was drive his empty trailer back to Phoenix and wait for his next assignment. Pretend that the past 24 hours had been nothing more than a series of unfortunate mechanical failures and heat-induced confusion. The highway stretched ahead of him, familiar and ordinary, and Rayford tried to convince himself that everything was going to be fine. He'd survived whatever had happened at those stations, had escaped with his life and his sanity mostly intact, and could now return to his normal routine. But as he drove, he started noticing things he'd never paid attention to before. Small gas stations at remote exits that looked slightly too perfect, too maintained despite appearing abandoned. Patterns in how other trucks moved on the highway. Clusters of vehicles that seemed to travel together without obvious reason. Signs and markers that appeared nowhere on his GPS, but that other drivers seemed to recognize and respond to. 3 weeks later, Rayford received a package at his home address with no return label and no indication of who had sent it. Inside was a map of the southwestern United States with 63 red dots marked at various locations, each one numbered sequentially. Station number 47 was marked near the location where he'd had his breakdown, and Station 1 was in a remote part of New Mexico that looked like nothing but empty desert. A note accompanied the map, typed on plain white paper with no identifying information. "You're a part of the pattern now, Rayford. Welcome to the network. We'll be seeing you at station number 23 in approximately 4 months. Your route will take you there naturally, no need to make special plans. Just follow your normal schedule and you'll arrive exactly when you're supposed to." He burned the map immediately, destroyed the note, and tried to forget that it had ever arrived. But 4 months later, when his dispatcher assigned him a load from El Paso to Las Vegas, Rayford pulled up his route and felt his heart sink as he saw that it passed within 10 miles of where station number 23 would be located based on that destroyed map he'd memorized despite himself. He could request a different route, could claim he needed to avoid that area for personal reasons, but some part of him knew it wouldn't matter. The network had documented him, had recorded his information and his patterns, and eventually he'd end up at station number 23 whether he wanted to or not. Some roads pulled you in, and once you'd traveled them once, you could never fully escape their gravity. Rayford still drives trucks, still hauls loads across the Southwest, still checks in with his dispatcher and follows his routes. But now he carries that journal with him always, adding his own entries about the stations he passes and the patterns he's started to see in how certain drivers move through the network. He's learned to recognize others like him, people who've been documented and pulled into awareness of something larger than themselves. They never talk about it directly, never acknowledge their shared knowledge, but they recognize each other at truck stops and rest areas, a brief eye contact that confirms they've both seen behind the curtain that most drivers never know exists. Sometimes, late at night when he's pulled over to rest, Rayford wakes to find his truck's fuel gauge reading empty, even though he knows the tanks are full. He knows what it means now, knows that it's a signal that he's approaching one of the numbered stations, and that they're aware of his presence. He could drive on, could ignore the false reading and continue with his route, but he's learned that doing so only delays the inevitable. Eventually, mechanical failures or route changes or simple coincidence will deliver him to whatever station is waiting for him, and whatever purpose the network has for him will be fulfilled. He's part of the pattern now, has been since that day at the abandoned station where Eldon showed him the journal, and patterns, once established, are almost impossible to break.